a retired homicide detective. I've interviewed thousands of people, from serial killers to ministers. Welcome to the interview room. Evening on this wonderful Sunday evening. We hope that you're able to gather around with your friends and your family, and we have a really special program planned for you this evening. As you can tell, I've got Dr. Gary Brucato and, of course, our colleague, she should be a doctor, Francine Bardole, who is the founder of the Cold Case Solutions and Resources Company, but she's also a colleague of CCF Cold Case Foundation. So let me tell you a couple of things tonight. We are so grateful to each and every one of you, all of our subscribers, and of course all of our Patreon members. But without you, this show would not be successful. I just want to thank each and every one of you. We are over 207,000 subscribers, and that is a direct result of you folks out there making Karen and myself as successful on this channel. We are so appreciative of each and every one of you, and of course, Buddy, who is also thankful. He's over on the left-hand corner over here tonight, sound asleep, but he'll be up, I'm sure of it, in a couple of minutes running around. Karen bought him a big new toy. Also, our mods, those of you who have been with us from day one, we're so appreciative of Miss Sophia, Teresa M, Maui Girl, Mimi J2, Laura Wilding. Laura, we are one little family here on that side of the interview room where some of our mods have been experiencing family issues in terms of health, and we just want to make sure that everybody is in your prayers. Specifically, Teresa and her husband, they're going through some health situations, as well as Miss Sophia, obviously, who bounced back, if you can believe it. She was away for 2 months after having some health issues, and then came back and immediately jumped right back in. But and then, of course, Maui Girl over in Maui, after the devastation of all those fires over there, she's watched that community it's just horrific that what's happened over there. People one day had a great, thriving life going, and the next day it's gone. I mean, within 24 hours. And as always, Mimi J2 and Laura, we love you both. And I just wanted to point that out about our mods tonight, because they keep our chat not only above classy, but as you guys know, you get to interact with them. And for that, we are grateful. So tonight, we're going to talk all things DNA, and I could not have thought, Karen and I were thinking through this, I could not have thought of having two great guests here, but one, Francine Bardole. If you have not known Francine, you are in for a real treat tonight. And those of you who are new to the channel, she is the real deal. And she's got a little hidden secret that I tell everybody about. She doesn't talk about it very much, but we did an episode where Believe it or not, if you're new here, this is going to blow your mind. Guess who Francine's neighbor was back in the day? All right, I'm going to let her tell you who, Francine, who was your neighbor?
Oh, he was the most handsome, intelligent, devastating man I have ever known. His name was Ted Bundy.
And he babysat your child.
Well, I babysat his girlfriend's child, but he would take my girlfriend's son and my son swimming. And he was really good with them. He was good with children, and he really liked taking care of kids. You know, if he took them places, he'd take them swimming, he'd take them play tennis, he'd take them all these places. And my son liked him, and his friend liked him. But one day my son came home and he said, I don't want to go swim with Ted anymore. And as a mother, I'm going, oh no, what has he done? But I didn't want to put fear into my son. So I said, well, why not? And he said, well, because he plays this game called Shark and he's always biting me. And everyone out there knows that's how Ted, they confirmed Ted was the killer due to bite marks on one of the sorority sisters. And I never thought my son would be an appetizer. I could not believe this when he was arrested. You can imagine how I felt, because he'd come into my home, we'd talk, and that was a very surprising thing. And then also back in the day, and maybe somebody could relate to this. I hope a few of you can, but you know, there's the notion that, you know, if somebody's a serial killer, they look like one. You know, they don't look like Ted, and that was a shocker, because you tend to trust people who look, you know, well groomed, dressed well, you know, and are part of the community. And John Wayne Gacy, I guess, was one of those even. But anyway, yeah, it was a shocker.
Well, I'll tell you, Francine, not to add to your horror about this, but I participated in a show that was done, I think, by Oxygen Peacock. It was called Violent Minds, Killers on Tape. And we looked at the Bundy case. And one of the things we learned that I think is sort of novel is that a woman came forward who said that Bundy, when he was first experimenting with asphyxiating people, would take her swimming and hold her head under the water to see how long she could go, you know, with the little air bubbles and so forth. And she didn't realize that what he was doing. She thought he was just fooling around. But in the context of his life, it looks like he was starting to develop a kink about holding people's breath.
Right. Yeah. Well, then I feel so good. I sent my son swimming with him.
Well, as I'm saying, it's a disturbing to think about.
It is.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, and we talked at length about that, and I'm going to put that link. It's going to be in the video. You'll see it in the upper right-hand corner when we're done this. I'll link that video of Francine's experiences with Ted. But let me tell you a little bit about her. She is a pioneer in the DNA field. She's a DNA expert, and she is the I don't know, what do you say, the inventor? What do you say?
Well, that's a good word. I am the inventor.
Okay, the inventor of what they call the Bardole Method. And she's a member of the Cold Case Foundation and a founder of Cold Case Solutions and Resources. She pioneered the Bardole Method, and that is a DNA extraction method, while that utilizes the MVAC, and it's a wet vacuum DNA collection used for surfaces and touch DNA. And the Bardole Method can get DNA from small items that traditionally can be swabbed, like shell casings, fingernails, jewelry, more. And I know personally you've also pulled DNA off of rocks and successfully. Her bio is going to be down below on our website, but I could not think of anybody, you know, better to have on tonight to talk about DNA, specifically about the Kohberger DNA in relationship to, you know, the sheath in of itself and the snap where DNA was extracted. And I would submit that it's probably going to be they utilized your method to do it. I don't know that for sure. I don't know if you've been contacted, but anyway, her bio is below. And then, of course, we have Dr. Gary Brucato with us, who is also a member of the Cold Case Foundation. He's the co-author of the Columbia University Mass Murder Database, which is the largest in the world. And unfortunately, it keeps getting bigger by the day or by the month. And he's also the co-author of The New Evil, The Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime, with Dr. Michael Stone, who has passed away. The two are dear friends, but also colleagues and researchers. He has amassed a database of well over 119 years worth of data in relationship to mass murders. And not only that, just homicides. I mean, every time I talk to Gary, and he's asked me about my cases, he goes, well, just a minute, let me show. Oh, yeah. And he starts telling me details about the cases that I'm on, that I've worked. And he's like, well, yeah, this, but, and I'm like, Gary, I was there. And we laugh for quite some time. And of course, here's his book. It's on Amazon. It's The New Evil. You have to get a copy of it. And I know, Francine, you're hopefully going to put a chapter in a new book that's coming up on DNA. And so I just want to also remind everybody that tonight's conversation is going to revolve around the victims. It's not necessarily going to revolve just around Brian Kohberger, but we are always victim-centered here on Ethan, Maddie, Kaylee, and Xana. And this is a horrific crime scene. And obviously we don't have the totality of the horror that took place in that house. But I wanted everybody to recognize that not only does Francine, work in lab, settings, but she's also a very experienced criminalist in terms of responding, collecting evidence, and then making sense of that evidence. And so I want it from her, through her eyes, and you folks in the chat. Tonight's going to be a great night to ask really, any kind of question about DNA, because Francine makes it just is simple. She makes it simple because it's so complicated, but she breaks it down in such a way that even a guy like me can wrap my mind around it.
Well, Chris, I have in my database that Francine worked the Beslanovich case, the Crystal Beslanovich case, and you got DNA from a rock.
Yeah, well, I wasn't the one that got the DNA, but it was the MVAC that did.
Well,
and so what was funny is they didn't think, because, back in the day, you didn't collect rocks because you knew you couldn't get fingerprints off of it. You knew you couldn't get DNA off of it. But the medical examiner, for some divine reason, way back then said, I think you should collect that rock. This is in the 90s, And so they did, and they heard about the MVAC, and sure enough, I used the MVAC on that, and it got the person's DNA.
Yeah, and what peace that must have given to the family.
Well, this is what it's really all about when you think about it. It's about the families. They're the ones that are left behind, that bear the grief, the pain, wanting to have questions answered, and it tortures them. It tortures them for as long as until it's solved. And that is really what it's all about, is the families. And between law enforcement and all the experts, especially the ones that we have, available to us, working as a team, the answers can start coming together. It's like all the team has a piece of the puzzle they can bring together to help solve. Yeah.
Well, that was a real triumph for you, that case.
It really was. And I had a recent one, but I can't discuss it right now. But just seeing the family and what they went through, and then the relief. It doesn't take away. I mean, there's no closure, but they get answers. And I think the Angie Dodge case, of course, was one of those as well, where a fellow was put in prison for over 20 years who was innocent, and they found the perpetrator or the suspect, and he's been arrested and he's in prison, and we were able to get that guy released from prison after 20 years.
Wow.
Amazing stuff, Chris, right?
Yeah, it is. And so that leads me, that's a great tee up for this situation, right? Because there's just so much information out there, and the defense recently, they've been asking for a couple of things. They want to change a venue, and then they come up with, the DNA, because it's, genetic DNA in terms of family and, ancestry.com, et cetera. And they're using all of those pieces. Sometimes I just wish, and this is a selfish thought process, I wish the victims would get as much, attention as the defendants get, post once the crimes, submitted to the DA. But of course, there's always that argument, a fair and fair trial, et cetera. But, the defense gets to get out there and throw around anything they want. And sometimes it sticks into a community. And now, the families are looking at changes of venue, et cetera. And so everybody, if you submit a question, I see it. And when we get into the conversation here, I promise you I'll put it up. I'm flagging some of these behind here. But so don't think I didn't see your question, okay, first of all. So, okay, this thing goes down, 1122, right, King Street, Moscow, Idaho. And you get the call, all right? You roll up, Francine. You've got 2 victims upstairs, 2 victims downstairs, or excuse me, second floor, 2 on the third floor, 2 on the second floor. And you learn that there is a knife sheath underneath one of the victims on the third floor. First of all, this crime scene in of itself, how would you have approached this particular building?
Well, in the first place, I wouldn't look at it as a crime scene, because you have 2 crime scenes. You have, the second floor and the third floor. Okay, and so it would be 2 crime scenes. And this is something you can't hurry through. This is something you have to do very methodically, and you have to take it a step at a time. Now, I am sure when I worked crime scenes, I had a wonderful partner who we knew how to do this and how to handle it. So I could easily give her one of the floors, and I could take another floor. In addition, when I would be called out, I tried to get experts from various law enforcement agencies around the area that I didn't have the expertise in. And so there has been crime scenes where there were bloody handprints, bloody fingerprints. I am not a handprint expert. I'm not a fingerprint expert. So I would call out somebody who was. Shoe impressions, the same thing in blood. I would call someone out who was. Same thing about not just photographing the crime scene, but getting, an entire, video and everything of the crime scene, so you could see where everything was. And I was not an expert at that, so I would get the expert to come out who had that. And they often had special software as well that could do, take photos of blood pattern analysis and stuff. So there's some really good stuff out there. So it's really important to realize who around your area are the experts, and the state lab has experts. And you should use those experts as well. And I don't know exactly who came out to this crime scene, but it's 2 of them. And when you're talking about the knife sheath, it's really interesting how sometimes things will be hidden underneath a person, a body, an item of like a pillow or a cushion or something. And so I'm sure that they have to take precautions, when they collect items of evidence that are going to be used for DNA. And in the olden days, that wasn't really used that much. But as DNA became well known, you look at the O.J. Simpson case, and if you look at any of the photos there, they're walking around in their shoes, and there's no gloves and stuff like that. Things have changed immensely. So taking precautions to protect the DNA from cross-contamination are important as well. So, and I'm sure that they know the protocol for that, where you mask up and glove up if you're going to collect DNA. And so finding this, this is what I'm assuming. If the sheath, did you say it was by the body or under the body?
It was next to the body.
Okay, that would be easy to see then. I would think that, because if it was under the body, that would be a different story. You would have to wait until, this is what I would have to do, is wait until the medical examiner or the coroner comes out and removes the body, because the body, they are the ones that take possession of that, and you don't want to move anything until they're there. So since it was on the side of the body, you could see that easily. Photographs are taken. Crime scenes, you take photographs. You take really good photographs. You take a lot of photographs, and you take video for the most part as well. And so I'm assuming this is what was done. But when they found this knife sheath, I'm sure that just looking at the injuries, they could tell they were inflicted by a sharp instrument, a knife. And so that's a win. Let's see what, why is this knife sheath next to this body? And we can see they have been stabbed. A knife has been used as the weapon. So that's kind of like a aha moment. Let's collect this. And in collecting this, they would, of course, before they moved it, they'd take pictures of it from far away, mid-range and close up. And then they take a real close picture of the knife. And then they would, of course, they number the item of evidence. And you have to take pictures of the number so you can identify where it is. Also in crime scenes, they, a really, good thing to do is have a sketch of the room, where the rooms are, and where, and also the software can do that as well. That takes photos of it or the video of it, the whole entire area. But you want to take photos so that as time goes on, where that was. And so once that was all done and they were able to collect it, I'm sure they used gloves and they collected it. But the important thing about DNA, anything that you want to get off of DNA off of, you put it in paper. Okay, it's important to put it in paper.
Tell the audience why that's so important.
Because DNA is alive, it's there, and you don't want to smother it. You don't want it to mold. You don't want it to get moisture on it and heat on it inside of a plastic bag. The only time I would say it would probably be okay is if the item is dripping with blood. You don't want to get that in your, mess up all your car, your evidence that's in the bag or anything. You would probably put it in a plastic bag for that short time of transport to the station, to where you can take it out and have it dried. That's the only time. Never should you book anything in that is wet, because you don't want to risk that chance. I will say, believe it or not, there have been cases that I have been able to work where mold has been on the clothing, and I'd had to work areas where the mold there are small areas on the clothing that don't have mold that I have to cut out, and I have to use those. But it makes it much better if you always put it in paper. So I'm sure they put this in paper. And I am assuming, after they took the photos and everything, I don't know where they first sent it. I don't know if you know or not, Chris, where it was first sent. I couldn't find anything where it said it was first sent. Depending on the experts who were there, usually the state lab.
Yeah, I think it was sent to the state lab.
Yeah,
first.
usually a state lab, and that's just fine, because the state lab, that's what they do. They do evidence, and I have no issue with that. I think that's not bad at all. But if they can't get anything, then you have to move on to a lab that might have the specialty to get something. So
real fast, I don't mean to interrupt, but I just want to keep tracking you here for the audience so everybody stays on track here. Help people understand the reason, right? You don't wait for a crime scene to dry out, right? You took if there's clothing that's collected from the ME's office, that clothing comes back to the crime lab and it's put into dryers. Explain that process as to why that's important.
Well, and we still have some things that I'm sure that have to be addressed.
And not tumbling dryers, right?
Well,
we used to call them the fish tank.
Yeah, so they have actual dryers that you can dry them, or you can set them up in the lab and you can put them on clean butcher paper and allow them to dry. There's numerous ways you can dry. This was a leather sheath. It looked like, rawhide or hide, some sort of thing. So that would probably, if there was a lot of blood on it, you have to dry for, a while until you could really work with it. But yeah, one of the things is you don't want to put the items of evidence that may have blood on them all together in a sack. You should put them in separate packages. And really, I can't express this enough. And we've gone long enough in the history of collecting evidence that you shouldn't just wad up a piece of bloody clothing and put it in the sack, or fold it up nice and neat and put it in the sack, because anything can be, you can get transfer from the blood. You can get cross-contamination. There's other things that can happen. So you want to make sure you dry that. And then when you wrap it up, you put paper in between the areas where you're folding so that it doesn't transfer onto another part of that item of evidence. That's important. And in the olden days, they didn't really do that. So that's something we have to, really keep in mind. But the sheath, I think, was kind of a standalone. You could take it in and you could dry it. And it sounds like they handled everything, as far as that goes, really well. And so this is a pivotal piece of evidence, because what I said, if stab wounds, and after the autopsy, everything that it says, how big of a knife it was and the opening and everything, those stab wounds, they're going to tell that. So this is really important. So there's two places on this knife that I would look at. Okay. Now, they did not use the Bardole method. I'm the only one that uses that. So they did another method, and they do have some methods where they can do soaking and swabbing. Okay. And it can work. All right. And so I don't know exactly what they did with that. I would think that they might do a soaking swabbing method on the snap or the button. And so the button, remember, as I recall, the button has the snap part on the bottom, and then the top part where it snaps on. So that's something that I don't know if they swabbed it or if they removed it and then did the soaking swabbing. I don't know how they did that.
Francine, I know they used something that was called the short tandem repeat analysis. Can you maybe tell the audience what that means?
Yeah, so that is called, to abbreviate it, it's STR DNA. STR DNA, we all have. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. So STR is what's used in our CODIS database. Okay. And that's for traditional DNA testing. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so that's the kind of DNA testing they did on that. Okay.
Oh, I see.
And so whatever they got from that, that's what they did. Now that's the button, the snap. Mm-hmm. Now you have the rest of that sheath. What are we going to do with that? Mm-hmm. Okay. And so I don't know if they swabbed it. They probably did. In my case, I would MVAC it. Let me just explain to everyone what an MVAC is, so you can kind of picture it in your head.
And also explain the method that they may have used, the wet method.
The soaking swabbing method?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the soaking swabbing method would be they soak the item of evidence. Usually I'm thinking, because it's metal, they soak it in a chemical cocktail, and then after they've soaked that, and this kind of allows for the DNA that's on the item to be in this cocktail. And then they also will swab it. And so they'll add the cocktail and the swabbing method, to get DNA. And the problem with the chemical cocktail is that it can inhibit the metal ions. It has, ions that can inhibit the DNA. So that can make it, not be as strong and robust as it could be. The sheath, like I said, the MVAC would have been great. I'm thinking they probably did really good swabbings on it, is what I'm thinking they did. Unless they use the MVAC. And the MVAC is like a little mini carpet cleaner. And if you've ever done your carpets, picture this little nozzle that's a solution gets sprayed out of this little nozzle, and they put it on top of the item of evidence, and the water or the solution goes onto the item of evidence, and then it goes across and sucks up that water, that solution, as just like you would your carpet, and only it's very small. And this sterile solution allows for the DNA that is trapped in the pores or the areas of the item of evidence, whether it's a seam, whether it's the leather, they're not nice, smooth, skin cells are not nice, smooth little discs. They can hang in there. And so it kind of loosens them up and allows them to be sucked up by the vacuum. And so that's how the MVAC works. And they could have used that on it. Swabbing could work. MVAC does get 12% more DNA as per the FBI research than other methods. So they could have done either one. But they did get DNA. And that's the important thing. Now we need to know, okay, whose DNA is it? All right. Now at the time, they weren't sure. I think they were getting an idea about possibilities due to people seeing things and reporting things and stuff. And so what happened was they say, okay, we have some DNA on this snap, and we have some DNA, say, on the sheath. I don't know for sure if they talk about the sheath as well as the buttons, so I'm assuming both. And so who does it belong to? And they have an idea who it will belong to. They have an idea. And so what they did is they went to Kohberger's father's residence, and they took out, let's see, what was it? They took some trash from the garbage. We call that a dumpster dive, a trash pickup, whatever. And they took that and they found some DNA. And you'd say, okay, well, how do you know it belonged to his father? How come, it didn't belong to, one of the females in the house or whatever? So I believe what they did was when they got that DNA, that if you look at the research on this, they took this DNA. Now, remember, you talked about STR DNA. Okay, STR DNA, picture it this way. You get DNA from your mom and your dad. And from your mom, you'll get 2 X chromosomes. Okay? From your dad, depending if you're male or female, you get an X chromosome or a Y chromosome. Only men have the Y chromosome. That's from your father. That's a patriarchal line. Okay? So your father basically decides if you're going to be a boy or a girl. You either get the X chromosome from him or you get the Y chromosome. So the male chromosome is very important. Okay? And so what they did is, I believe they did, instead of STR and YSTR DNA testing, they did what's called SNPs, SNPs. Now, SNPs are totally different when it comes to databases and getting DNA.
So walk the audience through that.
Okay. So the STR goes into our CODIS database. That's the one that FBI runs, state runs. It goes all over the United States. And that's the traditional way that we identify a person. Then we also have Y STR, which is male, and there are some Y databases, and you get that from your father. And you look for the Y or the male DNA in something. Now with SNPs, it's like apples and oranges. You can't do the same thing. You have to have a whole different type of testing for STR, whole different type of testing for YSTR. And then when it comes to SNPs, that is genealogical DNA. Okay, that's what we're going to use to identify this DNA. Who does it belong to? Okay, and this is really big because this is what's going on with cases now. Is a lot of the so STR DNA can ID a person. Give you an idea. So to ID an individual, you have to have what is 20. They have markers, or they call it loci, which is loci is like a location on the human gene, that genome that you want to take. These are markers. These are places on that DNA strand that we want to have our DNA so we can identify them. Look at those loci or locations as a house, as an address where someone lives. Somebody lives at this address. Now, who lives in that loci or address? How do we know that? What they do is they get alleles. You got one from your mom and you got one from your dad, and that's who lives in there. At each location, at each house, there will be alleles. Now, is there one allele, two alleles? Is there 4 alleles? Telling you how many people are involved in this in that one house. So with STR, you get more results. STR can tell you, say it does phenotyping. That's what they use for phenotyping. And that is where they can tell a percentage of what color of hair they have, if they're fair skin, light skin, what color of eyes. It gives more individual, and SNPs are also used to help determine diseases and what people are susceptible to and things like that. So it's more information than traditional STR or YSTR. SNPs give you more information. So they got this information from the trash at the Kohberger's house, and it found out that it belonged to Brian's father. Now, how did they get, okay, how did they know that? Well, because a long time ago, Brian's father gave his DNA, I believe it was on a church project where they could tell you basically your ancestry and things like this. And it might have been through ancestry.com. I'm not sure. But I do remember the predominant church in Utah was doing that, and a lot of people were uploading their DNA. And so, they were able to find out because, let me get back a little bit when it comes to DNA. When you do a DNA now, probably in the last 3 years, maybe 4, you have to enter, if you allow permission for police to check that database for your genealogical DNA. So you either agree or disagree. From my understanding, they went through GEDmatch or family tree. One or the other is what I understand they did. So that's how they honed it down to Kohberger's father. And then from there, I think they did get a cheek swab from Brian, and that's a buccal swab. The reason they call it buccal is because the cells inside your mouth are called buccal cells. So they swabbed the inside of his mouth to get his DNA to match it up to the DNA that they had. And they said there was a statistical match.
Okay, so I want to back up real fast.
Okay.
This is fascinating, by the way, as always. All right, so touch DNA on the swab, or excuse me, on the button, the sheath. Okay, on the button. Everybody says it's the button, so I'm assuming it's the top of the push button, but I don't think anybody knows other than the person that processed it.
Yeah.
Either way, it's on the button.
Right, right.
What is touch DNA?
Okay, touch DNA is where you deposit skin cells through touch. Okay, it doesn't have to just be on your hands. It could be, when you wear a hat, you get DNA on the hat, and you can get a lot of DNA. But when you touch something whether, wherever a DNA skin cells can come off is touch DNA. You can't see touch DNA. You just can't say, oh, well, let's see, I'm going to do this piece of evidence because I can see the touch DNA. You have to be very well informed, I think, in my opinion, about the case in order to make the determination of what area you're going to focus on. Now, the knife sheath, easy. It's not that huge. So you could easily, do that. And as far as the snap button, there's a lot of areas in the snap where skin cells can collect. There's that little hollow part that goes down on top of the snap, the head of the snap. And there's all those little ridges in it, just like a shell casing. There's all these ridges. There's all this stuff, and so you could get a lot of DNA from that. It's not impossible. You have to look at it and say. Let me tell you this way. In 2001, when I started working with police department, in order to have a DNA profile, you had to have a blood sample the size of a quarter. That was in 2001. It's gone to the point now where it's less than a pinhead. That's how far it's come. So imagine that's not that many skin cells, And so when we're thinking, oh, you need all these skin cells, you don't need that many, but you hope you get enough to get a profile of some sort. They have different kind of profiles. They have DNA profiles that you can put in the database. And then they have comparable profiles that you can compare to somebody. You can't put in the database, but there's enough there that you can compare it to a suspect. And then on the SNPs, they give so much more information than traditional DNA, STR, and YSTR. They give so much information. And so you have more to go on. And traditional DNA works in nanograms, and STR or SNPs works in picograms. So, and it works also with, SNPs also work really well with degraded DNA. So they can kind of use pieces of that degraded DNA. And so you have a better chance. This is the way of the future. This is where things are going to head. It's going to take a while, but, there was a time when the only way you could ID somebody was through fingerprints. That was the standard.
Right.
Now it's DNA. And now it's going to go down. I think DNA is important, but SNPs are going to be the next thing. And this is what the courts are probably having issues with. They want to know more about SNPs and things like, okay, it's a patriarchal line thing. It could have been somebody, related or whatever. We want to know, if this is actual, not somebody that's from the patriarchal or matriarchal lines of the suspect. And that's a legitimate, argument, because you do want to know that. Now, I don't know what other evidence was collected, but I have worked cases where they have used they've used SNPs, they've used hair. On hair, it's more mitochondrial DNA, because if it's hair without a root and just a shaft, that's mitochondrial. Mitochondrial is what you get from your mother. YSTR is what you get from your father. And so what you're getting is mitochondrial DNA. And this is a big thing because, we sometimes share the same mothers or whatever else, and we don't know, exactly. So what you want to do for right now, until the courts are satisfied with this, is take that piece of evidence that there is in question, that is using the genealogical databases, whatever that is, and whatever evidence that is that you use, and then use other items of evidence to back it up. I've done cases where they have had hair samples, but there might be the idea, oh, well, how do you know that wasn't transferred from, this person to that person or whatever else? But then if you have on top of it the DNA, which is the STR and YSTR DNA from the items of clothing that they had on, that the MVAC is excellent on. I've had cases where I've gotten DNA of the suspects from the clothing, and then the DNA or the SNP DNA, the genealogical DNA, shows it could be them, but more than likely, statistically speaking, is them. But this shows it is them. So you have two things together here. You have nuclear DNA and genealogical DNA.
Okay,
Well,
don't lose your train of thought, Gary. Go ahead.
Well, I just for this I wanted to mention that first of all, before there ever was even a suspect in the Kohberger case, Chris had this episode of the interview room where Greg Cooper and Ann Burgess and Dean Jackson and I were on with Chris, and we came up with what turned out to be a pretty spot on profile of Kohberger if he is guilty. I mean, it couldn't be more spot on, I think. And one of the things that we started talking about later after he emerged, and it turned out that there was DNA on this snap, is I remember asking the question at the time. I said, well, it's a very interesting guy because you have a guy going around purposely, he's been seen wearing gloves, clearly, to not leave DNA all over the place after, before arrest, after the killings. And one of the things I said was, wouldn't it be interesting if it turned out that this guy who was so cautious and so obsessional, with the gloves and all that, maybe he took them off at the time of the killing to fully experience it in the way that offenders will tell us they want their bare hands to be used for a fantasy-based murder. And maybe that's why when he actually goes and reaches for the snap, the glove isn't on, because there doesn't seem to be any trace of anything anywhere else. I mean, he's a very, very cautious guy. Why only there? So I started imagining maybe to fully experience it, he takes the glove off and then touches it. And then when this alibi was proposed, I have to tell you, there was a lot of fuss. The alibi was coming. Oh, it's going to blow the case up. And then it was very anticlimactic and I think rather silly. The idea that he was in this park, stargazing at night and the whole thing. And I said to Chris at the time on this show, I said, then what is this idea in their mind that while he's stargazing, a sheath that has a DNA profile that they said it's like 99.999% rules out anybody but Kohberger's father as being related to the kid. How did it get there? I mean, did it materialize? Did it fall out of the air? I mean, it really bugged you that this would be the defense. So I started thinking what they're probably going to come up with is some kind of story like he shook hands with the person who was the killer. He met the killer, and then the killer passes it on to the sheath, that kind of thing. And so one of the things I'm hoping you'll do is help people understand if that's a completely ridiculous idea, because there's no other explanation other than that he's in the room, unless there's a way to transfer that DNA onto the snap. But he would have to have had contact, I would imagine, in some way with the person who actually did it. Now, you already see when you say this out loud, I could just picture a jury going like, what? Like, that's sort of ridiculous. But I can't understand what other defense they're going to have. So I'm just wondering if you could sort of tell us the way you might attack that if you were in a courtroom, because I can't understand any other way that they could get around it, unless the technology itself is flawed and the profile is attacked.
Well, yeah, the attacking comes more, I think, from the side of the genealogy. When you talk about they couldn't get anything else because he wore gloves, interestingly enough, you can have secondary transfer from gloves. So how does he carry these gloves? Does he put them in his pocket before he wears them or not? And so depending on how they processed, did they swab areas of the clothing? That'd take a whole lot of swabs when you think of all the clothing. So you'd want to know how that was done. But defense is there to throw in as many kinks as they can and to defend their client. And so they're going to grasp at anything. And they'll come up with things just as strange as what you're talking about in order to give reasonable doubt, of some sort. I do believe if him wearing gloves and then snapping, that's highly probable. But even if he unsnapped it and he had gloves on, he carried that knife. He had that knife. That knife sheath was on his person, and that DNA was on it because it belonged to him or his father.
It could have been from long ago, even well before the offense.
It didn't look like a brand new knife sheath to me. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so you have to make that. You have to kind of be a little logical here. Yeah. How did it get there? It didn't have to get there at that crime scene. It didn't have to get there. It could have belonged to him, And heaven knows we've done enough cases where somebody's dropped something, they've left it behind, and we got their DNA from it.
And it wouldn't have corroded or been wiped away, or anything. It could have remained in the snap for a long time.
Oh heavens, yeah. I mean, to give you an example, and I'm gonna just okay. It can
Go, Francine, go.
I get passionate about this. I tell you, you guys interrupt me because I do get passionate. But I did a shell casing from a very old cold case, and this was long ago, probably before a lot of the audience was born. And I was able, on one shell casing, I was able to get a comparable DNA profile, meaning enough DNA to compare it to a suspect off of that. So yeah, DNA can last a long time, and it can embed in areas that will protect it. You know, just like on the shell casings, they say, oh, you can't get DNA from shell casings because the heat from the firearm destroys it. Well, guess what? I found out with my own research and invention that it's protected in a lot of areas on that shell casing that may look very smooth, but there's little areas where it can hide and be protected from the heat. So it's the same with that snap. It's the same with the seams on that sheath where they sewed it and where the person handled it. And as they handled it, they distributed DNA, and the snap distributed DNA. When they opened it, every time they opened it, they left something behind.
You know, I think it's important. I've always loved your passion for your work here. And I think if for some of the folks just coming in here, we're going to answer a lot of the questions. I see a lot of questions going up. Again, we're going to put those, I'm flagging them. I'm putting them in there, so don't worry. We'll try to get to them. But if you, a couple of things. One, Francine has testified as an expert in courtrooms all across the country. So, and so that's a no-brainer, number one. Where one of the things I also want to throw a curveball here, and Gary, your assessment early on of a potential perpetrator. Now, what I'm going to say here is going to be somewhat controversial, but as an investigator, you always and I think Gary just nodded his head because I think he knows where I'm going to go. I know. You always have to think outside of the box. And we have 3 members here of the Cold Case Foundation where this is what we do. We take the Mayo approach to basically putting a wall of people up, and we throw ideas. Well, one of the ideas that floated, and, it hasn't been shown in any way, shape, or form that there's a correlation or anything to that effect. But we have Francine on here, and she was neighbors and had, babysat, Ted Bundy's girlfriend's kid. And so she was very intimately, she knew Ted and called him Ted. Okay. If you're just joining us. Okay? And we still think she should write a book, right, about just that piece of her life. Okay, and then if we now fast forward, the park, and this is the first time you're going to hear this. Gary says, there was a gal that was murdered and dumped at that park where Brian Kohberger said he went to stargaze. And we all went, what? Hey. Now, it just so happens, and this has not been connected, I want it for the record tonight, it has not been connected to Ted Bundy. It has not, I'm going to say it one more time, and this is my opinion, it is not Dr. Brucato's opinion. It has not been connected to Ted Bundy. However, okay, everything kind of leaned that way early on in the investigation.
Right.
and there was a question mark that said, could Bundy have been in that arena at the time? Now, why that was so fascinating when he said that, you guys in the chat over here, Gary, do you remember the name of the victim? Did you?
I can give it to you, but the idea is that, you know, he said that he was in the Wawawaii Park, you know, that's where he was stargazing. And it's very important to understand that a woman, a very attractive blonde woman who attended school at Pullman at the time that Bundy was studying at Washington U, the same school Kohberger attended, studying criminology, right, was found dead there, dumped in that same park. And no one ever solved the case. Bundy was considered as a suspect. And Chris and I chatted about this, and I said, not that I'm saying that very seriously as a hypothesis, but just something intriguing to consider is that, let's say, for the sake of argument, Kohberger had studied Bundy and knew that the suspected first victim of Bundy was a woman killed living at Pullman, attending the same school Kohberger did, and he goes over the state lines into Idaho with her either body or kills her there and dumps her in that park. What an interesting little inside joke to give that place as the alibi site, right? A little homage to someone that one might admire is very interesting to me. And I don't know why that link hasn't been made by anyone. I suppose it could just be a marvelous coincidence, but it's very interesting.
I think it's an interesting,
very specific place, right? So,
right.
But yeah, I can give you the name of the victim. I just got to look it up.
And Dr. Gary, while you're doing that, while you're pulling the victim up, put it into chat, and everybody. I know this is going to start a firestorm.
I'm not saying it's that there's necessarily any link. I just think it's interesting.
And remember, I'm bringing it up that you had this. You threw it out there. I remember the day you threw it out there, and we all went, "Wow, wait a minute. Are you saying is that a possibility?" And there's always from an investigative analysis aspect, and I've worked over 300 murders in my career. From an investigative aspect, when a guy like Dr. Gary Brucato throws on the wall, "Hey guys, did you know? Here's a thought," then we have to grab that thought and say, wait a minute, let's reverse engineer this. And now we tie that into the personality that Dr. Brucato is talking about, which he nailed with Brian. If in fact, in his criminal justice research and all of his studies, if he was studying Ted Bundy at length, and we'll find out if that's ever going to be the case at some point during the trial, what an interesting correlation that would have been the place, like you just said, he would select for his alibi, where he would have gone, kind of like, in your face thought process. Now, we're not saying there's a connection, but there's
intriguing. It's intriguing. I'm totally agnostic about it. But yes. I think it's interesting. And but I will say that when I talked to I asked some experts about it, some other experts about it, and it was pointed out to me that one of them had been exposed to, when they were going in and interviewing Bundy about people that they thought he might have killed, they didn't recall him being asked about this particular victim. So they said, he probably wasn't considered a very strong candidate. However, as I understand it, there was somebody who was following that victim who met the physical characteristics of Bundy. Apparently, he drove a VW Bug, if I'm not mistaken. And in addition, there would have been the kind of opportunity, given that he was attending the school just over the state line in Washington there, and she's attending school at Pullman. I just think that's very interesting. But things can be coincidences. But that's the wonder. Yeah.
How many copycat murders have there been out there, though?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, who knows? This would have also predated the first canonical victim of Bundy by a couple of years, but she certainly looked like the victims. She had that same, attractive long hair parted in the middle, co-ed kind of situation going on. She was, if I'm not mistaken, found in a ditch in the park.
So I don't mean to.
I have to dig her name up, but I wasn't ever going to mention it. So, Chris, it's interesting to bring it up. But I
didn't mean to drift off, here. But we've got Francine here, who knew Ted, and now we're talking about, let's. I'm going to shift back to the DNA, and while you're looking for that gal's name and throw it into the chat for everybody, and let everybody, take a look at it for themselves and come to their own conclusions of whether or not it could or couldn't be. I mean, that's the one fascinating thing about this, just YouTube, to have these kind of conversations. And, what if it is? How interesting would that be? Right. And there's a correlation there. Okay. So they get dad, then they get him, Francine. Where do they go from there with IgG and all this other stuff?
Well, what they did is he was such a match. I mean, the match was so statistically his father and him. He shares the same as his father, and so that you take that along with the circumstantial evidence that they have. Everybody says, "Oh, that's circumstantial." Well, you got enough circumstantial evidence to help back things up. There have been cases that have been won on circumstantial evidence, and so you need to take the totality of everything, which includes the crime scene, other things that were collected. It also includes, the cell phones. There were eyewitnesses. There's so much that you can bring into this, to say, okay, it's him. Now, in my thoughts, I don't know. I just have a hard time believing that even though he wore gloves. I'll give you an example. This was done in November? In November. I don't know how hot that house was. I don't know how warm it was. I don't know the temperature, but I've done plenty of cases where I found sweat drops, that have been on the items of clothing when they're just worked up into this fever, and they're just stabbing, and they're sometimes it could be saliva or sweat, but you can see that they're different than something else. It looks different, and you can also do testing for saliva. But my point being is, I have a hard time believing that the people that he stabbed, he didn't leave something on that. On the clothing or whatever they had on. And also, I am sure that they took fingernails and, they processed those and stuff. But if they were just, sidelined and they didn't have a chance to defend, I don't know what the defense, when you see defense wounds on a hand, that they were trying to defend themselves. And sometimes they'll push or they'll grab or whatever and get stuff under their fingernails. So I don't know what happened on that, but I do believe he didn't just stand there with his knife, like in, what is that show, Psycho? Just stab, stab, stab. That's not what happens. They have to have some leverage. They have to hold on and stab to do this, or they have to pull, or there's some sort of touching, in order to do this. And so what I do, and we all do, with the Cold Case Foundation as well, we look at the case photos and we look how somebody is laying and what's going on. And we can make a decision, as this is an area where I think he had to have, grabbed her, or you'll see how the clothing is, or you'll see different things that'll show that something happened there just besides a stab. Mm-hmm. So, those are things I'm sure they looked at, but that's very critical in making a determination of where you're going to focus your attention.
So, Gary, this is the name of the victim. And she was found on April 16th, 1972 in the canyon. how do you pronounce that? Wawawai? You're muted.
Yeah, that would have been about. It was in a gully, basically, which would have been about 10 to 15 miles south of Pullman. And so it's like a canyon, Wawawai Canyon, which it appears is encompassed within that kind of park area. That's a very large area. So this is very, very interesting. But you would have to be pretty intimate with Bundy and the potential victims to even know that. I mean, I think it's amazing nobody thought of this, but again, could be a remarkable coincidence. But it's worth looking at.
Well, yeah, and Ted Bundy had his way of how he killed people. You know, he had his way of how he would hit the blow to knock them out. They believe that was with the tire iron.
Mm-hmm.
And he also had his own little oddities that he did. The question would be on that body, where's the evidence? Was it the problem with evidence is sometimes it's destroyed. They didn't really, that was uncommon for things after so long you destroy. So do they still have it? How is it stored? And all these other different things to see if they could move forward and see, whose DNA is on there. Especially, the thing about, I want to bring attention to everybody, though, something that's very critical because a lot of police ask this. When it comes to genealogical DNA, one thing is, and SNPs as well, that mixtures can be an issue. Now, Othram does a great job. They do whole genome sequencing, which gives you more than anything. But the problem is, if you have, you're going to get a mixture. Say, for example, we have. See, who is it? It's Mandy. Is that? Let's see. So it would be. Trying to think of which victim it is that where the sheath was found. Was that
Yeah,
Maddie?
Kaylee and Maddie. Yeah, they were in the same bed.
Yeah. And so the interesting things, if you did DNA. And you saw that there was a possibility where he might have grabbed hold and, pulled a shirt down a certain way or whatever, you're going to have victim DNA on there. There's no question you're going to have victim DNA on there. So that's probably going to be your, that unless it's if it's just touch DNA or whatever, I don't know what there is on the clothing. But if you go over 2, it's going to get, that's too many mixtures. And so mostly when it comes to genealogical DNA, if you can get the mixture, the big profile from the suspect and not the victim, then you can do that. But if not, it makes it difficult. And so dealing with mixtures is something they're working on and trying to make sure that, they can do more than just 2. And so for a rule of thumb, a single source, which, one mixture. So if there was sweat, if there was blood that belonged to the suspect, if there was semen that belonged to the suspect, something like that, that'd be a single source. Okay. And so that works very well with that. So that's one of the things that's going to get better with DNA. And so but that is one thing that is kind of difficult. You have to make sure that, you have a large mixture for the suspect.
Okay. So there's a lot of chatter on the internet, about this, he was framed, okay, that the knife sheath was, placed there at the crime scene, and et cetera, et cetera. So let's talk about just your thought process on, and then we'll start getting into some of these questions. What could go wrong with the collection process at the crime scene? What could go wrong with the lab process, and what are the pluses and minuses of IgG? I think that the defense is going to attack IgG, investigative genetic genealogy. Mm-hmm. Help our audience understand those 3 processes.
Okay, well, first of all, like I said before, IgG is still kind of, being accepted in courts and is going through the the gamut when it comes to genealogy. Okay, and this is not uncommon. And so, like I said, in order to back that up, having some other evidence, which I do believe there has to be something, if they could possibly look into, there's a lot of places that have MVAC. I have it. There's a lot of other labs that do, but I will say I am the most experienced in the United States. But that's the possibility of having something, because that's what happened in a case that I did. All they had was a piece of evidence that was from genealogical DNA, and then they had the DNA from the item, the traditional STR. Why STR? DNA from the clothing. So they complemented each other on that. As far as the collection of evidence, there's always, if you don't collect it right, there can be cross-contamination. But if there's cross-contamination, I'm still asking, how did the knife sheath get there, and how did it get on the sheath? Okay. The other one is, was it planted? And I know that comes up in some cases that, the police probably planted it. That was the O.J. Simpson case. That was kind of the idea, because the reason, just so everybody knows, crime scene units didn't really start popping up until after the O.J. Simpson case, because of the way the evidence was handled. And that is very important, the chain of custody, who had a hold of it, who booked it in, who collected it. All this information should be a tight chain of custody, okay? And so I am sure defense and prosecution have those records. They have to know what the chain of custody it is. And they can also talk to whoever packaged it, whoever collected, whatever. How did they do it? Now, when I go to court and they say, how do you know that you're the one that did that? I said, because I collect it this way every time. And I put my initials and the case number and everything on the packaging the same every time. And that's one of the things I learned early on, that I can tell how I do something, because I do it the same every time when it comes to packaging and collecting. If it's a shirt, put it in butcher paper. I dry it, put it in butcher paper, put it in a sack, initial it, you date it, put all the information. As far as police, I mean, I'm not saying it can't happen. I am not saying that. But what I'm saying is, there's so many eyes on and so many people there, it would be very difficult to sneak something in, especially a sheath. So here's how it works. When I go to a crime scene, nobody has gone in that crime scene, with the exception, maybe the responding officer might have stepped in and looked at it and then called for help.
Well, remember, there's a gap, though. There's a gap between the 911 call and the discovery of the bodies. Mm-hmm. And they're saying, people are putting out there in theory, mm-hmm. that no, somebody could have gone up there and discovered them and then dropped, Brian's sheath up there, right? I mean, that's floating around there, and that, et cetera. So
then we need to find that person, don't we? Whose DNA is on that sheath, or right. Where's that person? I'm just saying that, there is that gap, but mm-hmm. you have to look at the probability. You have to look at the possibilities and the evidence. And so when I would go into a crime scene, the detective and I, we clear, the house has been cleared by, officers and everything. And they call for detectives and for the crime scene unit. And so before we even go in, we have a briefing and we talk about who's going to do what. Okay. Well, I'm going to take the photographs, and they're going to take, do a rough sketch of the layout of the house and the rooms, and you're going to lay the numbers down. So we kind of, decide who's going to do what. But before we do any touching of anything, I go in and I take it's called pristine photographs of the crime scene before it has been touched, altered, anything placed in it, anything. I take pristine photographs so that I know where everything is. So that, now remember, we do far away, we do medium, and then we do close. Okay. And we do that to show where everything is laying and how it's laying. And we take it and then you have after I've done all the photographs, then I have the sketcher come in and start doing the sketch. And we start putting down numbers and room numbers and everything else. But nobody touches anything. And you never go into a crime scene without your gloves. I'm talking about surgical gloves, nitrile gloves, whatever, to protect it. You never go in without that. You never go in if you're going to collect DNA without a mask. Now, if you transfer DNA, if something accidentally happens, then whoever, they have crime scene logs. So whoever enters that place should have their name on the log. They're not allowed into that entrance port because you have an entrance area. Nobody can go in or out without signing in or out. And so if there's any question whose DNA, this is DNA we don't know, then we have the list of who is in there, and we can get their DNA. And if we think it was their hair, we can take their hair. Nobody should be in there unless they're willing to give their DNA. Okay. And they have no business being in there unless they're there to do their job.
Okay. I'm going to play devil's advocate.
Okay.
Which you guys know. Okay. Why Brian Kohberger? Who wants to frame Brian Kohberger? And why connect him to the four, to Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan? What is their motive if this knife sheath was put into that crime scene, which in my personal opinion, I'm going to be, just throw it out there. Come on, but so Gary, go ahead. What's your thought?
Well, I have to say, Chris, that in my experience with some types of people who commit offenses who lack empathy, let's say, they sometimes lack the ability to feel that other people could tell their story is ridiculous. And what I think you would expect, if this guy is guilty and is anything like we think he is, you would expect him to come up with a story that is weird, because he is weird. The things that he would say to people would probably have them feeling either very uncomfortable or very confused or weirded out, right? So I'm not surprised that would be the big bombshell explanation, because it's not logical. And and as just to clarify, I've been sitting here trying to get a clear answer on exactly where this woman I mentioned was found, and it looks like she was in the canyon that was near Pullman. Like, I think that's where the university area is, and this is like less than 10 miles from the house in Moscow, in Idaho, over the border, unless I'm very much misreading here. So I can't help but imagine he's talking about the same Wawawi Park, right? I mean, that state kind of park area. I just never knew when he gave the alibi if he was talking about park area in Idaho or park area in Washington. If he's talking about in Washington, then I think it's clearly the same park where this woman was. And, people in the audience are saying, listen, it might be very interesting if somebody picked that particular university to go to school because Bundy went there. And I don't think anybody had raised that question before. So it's just food for thought, not anything taken very seriously.
Well, but I think it's food for a psychological profile.
Well, that's what I'm kind of wondering about. I mean, if you have a person who's more interested in the mind of an offender and sort of admiring one, it may want to follow the footsteps and be that same type of, I'm outsmarting people right under their noses. I'm a student and I'm the one who's committing these offenses, etc. It's also very interesting that woman that I'm talking about, who was found in 1972, was stabbed. If she was in fact an early Bundy victim, it's interesting that he would have started potentially with stabbing and then went strangling and killing with ligatures and things like that. But that's very intriguing. So I just think it's something to explore, not to take too terribly seriously. But Chris, I think regarding who would frame him, or something, I mean, I agree.
Well, why him, right? We always ask the why, right? We never ask the how.
It's a little grandiose to think that people have nothing better to do than frame you. It's a little paranoid.
Right. So
weird.
I mean, if we look at what Francine's talking about here, let's say the DNA, boom, it's on target. It says that guy. And what are the odds? What are the numbers? I think they came back like a gazillion, right?
Yeah, or something.
That it's not him. I mean, it's almost the OJ numbers. You got to go to another planet to find the guy. Okay. But So you attack the process, which is what the defense is supposed to do, and that's what they're doing. They're attacking the process. They're bringing in, some gals who had genealogy as a hobby, and literally, I mean, I've read their bios, and now they've become experts in, IGG, unlike Francine, who has the most experience of anybody in the country, and I hope they call you, Francine. I hope the prosecution calls you and says, hey, by the way, we also have this other evidence, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole yet. I still want to go back to this common sense question. Okay. What is the motive? We know that these 4 victims have been brutally murdered, okay, while attending college and just living their lives. Somebody came in, the prosecution saying it's Brian Kohberger. The defense is saying we 100% believe he's innocent. Okay, both sides are doing what they're supposed to do. Okay? But why, from a public perspective or perception, why him? Why all of a sudden did the world say, you know what? This is the guy. I'm going to put his DNA in the crime scene. I'm just going to put it in there. Okay. Why? Why would that be? I've got a forensic psychologist and an expert in crime scene reconstruction, everything, collection, DNA. What are your thoughts?
Who should go first?
Whoever wants to grab.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think that'd be a great question for you, Gary. But as far as I'm looking at the evidence. I'm looking at what do we need to support this case. And I think that if somebody dropped a knife sheath to try to stabbed somebody or whatever to try to frame Kohberger, then, and honestly, there are people in prison that don't belong there. And there are people that have been ramrodded. Okay. And so if I were a defense attorney, I'd go after, what I could. So in order to put this to a sound, I guess, evidence state would be, you don't just look at the knife sheath. Even if he wore gloves, he had clothing on, he had things that could give secondary transfer. And when it comes to traditional DNA, STR DNA, what the CODIS database uses, and YSTR, that are male DNA, you can deal with mixtures a lot better than you can with genealogical DNA. Because I think I think they had to have something very particular that was found there. So let's look at some of the items of evidence. Let's look at those photos. Let's look at the items of evidence, and let's make a determination of what would be the most probable piece of evidence to process that could possibly have whoever stabbed any of these victims, that they had it on their clothing. If there was a fight, if there was something going on where somebody's pushing somebody, DNA just doesn't come from the skin. You can get it from clothing. It's called secondary transfer. That's what it's called, and you can get that. And so, I would look at the totality of the evidence. Okay, that's what I would look at. In fact, I have a lot of people say, well, how many cases have you solved? And I say, well, it's not up to me to solve them. My job is to get the DNA, and it's up to the investigator to solve them. So I can come up with DNA, and then it's up to them to find out whose DNA that is. And sometimes, it takes a lot. So all I'm saying is I would focus on the DNA. I would want to see the evidence. I'd like to see the totality. I would like to know what property was collected. I'd like to see the photos to see where it was collected from, and then make a decision along with law enforcement and the people involved in this case of what would be the best piece of evidence to move the pieces of, you probably could have so many pieces, but the best evidence that would have a suspect DNA on, because, if you go back to Locard's theory, you leave something, there's something that's left behind. And I don't care if we wore gloves or not. There could be a hair did you know how many items of evidence I have done that law enforcement has sent me, and I have found hair in the bottom of the sack, or I have found hair in a pocket, or I have found hairs that they didn't get. I found items that were still in the pocket. So I'm saying, you have to look at everything with a fine-tooth comb, and then make a decision. What am I going to do? And so it's up to somebody that has that deductive ability. And why would somebody do that? That's not my ball game. I know what I do for evidence, but Gary, it's probably in yours.
Well, I mean, we have to go into the realm of conjecture here, right, for this. But I have to say that I think, based on the profile of this accused person, that this is the kind of guy that would have been very awkward interpersonally, and would have tried to reduce a person of interest to him, or people as a mass that he was interested in, to a kind of science where he wanted to manipulate them like there was some kind of variable, and expect, like, what is the thing I have to do to get you to do this, right? Or study them the way we might look at something through a microscope, right? And so I thought it was very interesting, this whole idea of the way that he was probably watching these people, the particular person that I think was the center of the crime. Who I suspect,
do you think he had one, Garrett?
Yeah, I do. I suspect that there was one, and then because people were unexpectedly home, he had to kill multiple people. My hypothesis is that there was some mechanism by which he was watching what was going on in the home, but he had to shut it off that night that he went in to kill that particular victim, if he's guilty. And when he shut it off, everything in this little scientific setup didn't work out. People came home who weren't supposed to be there, were awake when they weren't supposed to be awake, etc. And he gets in there, and it turns into a mass murder when it was probably supposed to be an object of fantasy and obsession. All conjecture, but that's what the facts suggest to me. And the idea is, I think that if you have that kind of scientifically minded person, it's very interesting to think about lies and alibis and things people come up with, because they're kind of a projective test. I mean, if it's a lie, they're kind of a projective test where and imagine that he says, I was studying stars, these aloof, unavailable things that I want to turn into a science late into the night, all alone, right? Well, the stars that he was studying, of course, so the star that he was studying was whoever he was obsessed with, that he's sitting up all night, probably learning everything about them and analyzing them and turning them into a science, like a kind of astronomy. And they're untouchable and so forth. Of course, if we were ever able to touch a star, we'd be incinerated instantly, but that's a whole other story. But there's this whole idea of the untouchable and the unobtainable. And then imagine that kind of person who can't accept that he's invisible to the object of his fascination, unwanted, unattractive to them. Well, the fantasy would be, someone has made me into a science. There are people sitting around studying my DNA, manipulating the facts, trying to make me the object of focus. But in reality, nobody cared about him. So the fantasy is interesting, because even if that story turns out to be made up, isn't it interesting? It's as if he's saying, maybe one day somebody will study me. In those criminology classes, they'll study me. They'll sit around and say, what a fascinating genius he was. He almost got away with it, that kind of thing. And I think that if that's true, then part of the motivation, in addition to whatever this obsession may have been with one of the victims, that perhaps was some unspoken sexual component to it, some reducing people to a science, whatever, there may have also been this desire.
Now I want to clarify that, because I know what you mean, but a lot of folks are going to take that and
part?
say,
sexual component?
Yeah, but me, because I know what you mean.
Not overt, but
Right,
that doesn't mean
there is no sexual assault.
No,
as you know that, I know that.
But I don't think so. No, but the point is,
I don't want people just picking a word
right. That's a great point, Chris. But as Ann Burgess has taught us all, you don't need to actually touch a victim for your behavior toward them to be sexualized.
Right, because there's a whole fantasy play.
Right. If you're playing out a fantasy, and let's say you choose a knife because it's an instrument that gets you very close to the victim. You're penetrating the body with it. It can be a phallic substitute. It can be an expression of that kind of rage or the consumption of a person that if you can't have them, nobody will. That kind of thing. It can be sexualized. And you can bet that if a person goes in and commits that kind of offense, there's a pretty good chance that there have been sexualized behaviors in advance of the homicide, like looking at certain kinds of porn, stalking behavior, taking underwear, breaking into houses. All those things tend to happen in those kinds of people. And secondly, you can bet that there was sexual arousal afterward or when thinking about it. It would be very hard for me to believe that that wouldn't be arousing, right? And remember that this guy, if he's guilty, let's remember that when he was at school in DeSales, he was studying how people felt when they committed offenses. So
Yeah,
it's
that
like,
was his question.
right, it's like, imagine a person who says, wow, the best way to get an answer to that data point would be to try, and then you think about, like, that famous scientist who said the only way to find out how different insect stings feel is to let the insect sting him, and they created that pain scale, when I got bitten by a fire ant, it was blinding, that kind of thing. It's that scientific desire to know by actually doing.
Well, don't forget that Bundy, if you remember him, he was into pornography. He even said, before he died, he says he can blame what he did on pornography, and
That's what he said.
Yeah, he said that, and he did. That was a lot of what he did to his victims after. So,
Yeah.
Well, we could talk about that all day.
But there's commonalities, is what I'm saying. In what you're saying, there's commonalities, and if you wanted to study Bundy, you want to be just like him.
It's a really interesting point, but I have to ask you, Francine, the thing that's burning in me, that if I were a viewer of this show, the thing I'd want to know is this: if you are going to make the argument that he is in the park and that sheath with the DNA on it, with that profile, is in the house, by what mechanism could his DNA theoretically have gotten on that sheath without him being in the room? That's the $1 million question, and that's what I think they're going to push in court. That, and whether this kind of genealogical stuff should be admissible, because we live in this time when, like, they have to attack even science as possibly a lie or whatever. So what do you think? I mean, how could you rack your brains and explain that?
Well, like I said, that sheath could have easily had the DNA prior to him going in the room.
Somebody stole his knife and brought it in there?
Yeah, well, maybe somebody did. Maybe said, here, why don't you go do this and let me do some research on this? I don't know. But that's why I'm saying, you have to just not focus on the knife. You need to focus on the totality of the other evidence that's there and see what that had to offer. What has that evidence got to offer? Because I can see, that argument. I mean, defense is bringing up an argument, whether it seems logical or not. His DNA could have been on that knife and somebody could have had it, but that somebody stabbed them, so there was a knife that stabbed them, and somebody had to have had some leverage, whether they had gloves on or not, to stab them. And they could have spit, they could have sweat, they could have left hair. There's so many things that could have been left behind. So what I'm saying is, everything's being focused on the sheath because it was there was some DNA on there, and it belongs to Kohberger's father, who had matched Brian Kohberger's. Right. So yeah, but why not get some of the other items and bring them together and see what you have on them?
Right. Yeah, well, that's a great. Go ahead, Gary. No, Gary.
Francine, would you be surprised if, when this finally goes to trial, it turns out that they have more than just the snap DNA? Would you be surprised if they found something else, hair, or some other thing?
There was too much going on. There was too much going on not to leave something else behind.
Right. I mean, it's just amazing to me. I mean, I have to say, though, when you were talking earlier about the idea that he could have gotten DNA on it before, is he does seem like the guy that was a guy that was savvy enough that he would have cleaned it before. I mean, this guy was he had to be pretty meticulous to leave as little as he did. I mean, and the other thing is, he's actually seen by a survivor leaving the place, right? Well, wouldn't he have been completely covered in blood? I mean, where is all this blood? And what is the dog doing while all this is going on? That's in the that's in the, there's all these things that just don't make sense to me that in that Columbo way kind of keep you up at night going, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And just one more thing, and I think in the end, when that court case happens, there are a lot of things that are going to be settled for me. But right now, one of my big questions is, how did he leave nothing but a little DNA on a snap?
Well, and I think, folks, if we go back, we go back and read the search warrants. Remember, they found blood in his apartment on, I think it was the pillow, a pillow and a bedspread. And they also found dog hair. And we don't know what the lab analysis of either of those items are to this point, but they're in the search warrants. So that's kind of, Francine's point about, look, there has to be something more somewhere.
Yeah.
If we look at the video evidence that's going to be presented at some point, that one video camera that was taken right from the get-go on that corner house, I think that's going to be damning. If they see him get out of that car, or if his car is coming up. And remember that picture, this picture right here. I think I have it here.
So sad to see those kids, Chris, when every time you flash them,
it just kills me, because the family does not deserve all of this mishigosh. The family is trying to focus on their children, and we've got everything from Mark Furman to who. I'm teasing, but that it's like, let's remember why we're here, right? Always. And I love this picture right here. Absolutely love this picture. It's on another PowerPoint. I apologize, but it shows. Remember, the officers are out there, measuring it looked like tire tread on the pavement there, and I'm going to put in there, or I'm going to presuppose there, they got him, taken off right after the homicide, and it looks like, if he's the guy, then he came up, made the U-turn, came back, parked, committed the crime, and got out of there, because it is just so difficult with the totality of the evidence, to your point, Francine, just to focus only on the DNA snap, the DNA off of there. But when you take that, and then you take it and you engineer it to somebody, and what's fascinating about that is they're going to try to unengineer it to Brian Kohberger. Yet it's the same process to connect him to it. They're going to have to attack the process. When I thought that's always an interesting situation, when the defense takes on the experts, with other experts, and they kind of, try to disassemble, the Lego blocks and the picture of the puzzle, right? If you take 1,000, I always look at homicides as 1,000-piece puzzle set. And, you may get 995, but by golly, there's 5 missing. So therefore, there are 5 missing. So it couldn't be the Statue of Liberty. I mean, you can forget it.
Well, Francine, in your experience, how many times have you been in a case where they had this kind of DNA evidence and the person was acquitted? I mean, how probable is it that they could find a way to explain how?
I haven't had it yet. When you have the standard traditional DNA along with the next generation sequencing or genealogical DNA, I haven't had that yet, where it's a matter of reasonable doubt. It's a matter of how this case is presented, and you're presenting it to a jury trial. And this jury, you want to make sure, knows as much about what's going on in the process as they possibly can. And so they have a good understanding. And if you can get them to understand, what DNA is and how it's collected. And for example, like I said, why are they just focusing on the knife sheath? If I was in a jury and they're presenting this case, I know you're going to see, when you're there, here's the evidence that was collected, blah, blah, blah. Why wasn't this tested? And I have gone to court. I remember what made me want to get into DNA was I remember going to court and a fellow had beat his girlfriend, hit her in the face with the butt of a gun, caused her to split her lip. And it was in the day when you do as you're told, and that's it, if you're a crime scene person, and then the detective makes that decision. And so I remember this was pretty sharp on the jury. They got to write a question down, and one of the questions they said, did you do the DNA testing? Or could blood have been found on the firearm? And the answer was, well, possibly, because, she bled when she got cracked in the face and the lip with the firearm, the grips of it. And so they said, well, did you test it for DNA? And I said, no. And they said, why not? Because they didn't tell me to. And that's when I started really getting into DNA and saying, you know what? I think that if you know what to collect for DNA and you know what to focus on, you're going to get the answers. So I'm going to take this to the Kohberger case. Yeah, they have a knife sheath and they got DNA. I think it's fantastic that they did. I really do. Okay, so now if you're a defense attorney, you say, okay, well, how do you know that somebody just didn't, bring that there and plant it? Well, how do you prove that? Well, you've got to get other evidence as well and couple them together and say, yeah, we got DNA from the shoulder of Maddie's arm, or we got it off the pillowcase. Whatever, you've got to be able to say, it's not only just on the sheath, but it's on these other items. So I'm hoping they have other things that they can bring to the table, because it just strengthens it. In fact, on the one case that I did, that was pivotal. The DNA that was collected along with genealogical DNA.
Well, then you also have the defense is kind of, I think, by going and attacking that, they put themselves at a disadvantage, because they also have to show why his DNA wouldn't have been there, right?
Yep.
They have to prove it. And which is, that's problematic for the defense, because now they have to prove that somebody else saw it, right? Some other dude, put it in there, either the cops or the criminalist or, this Green Beret Army guy that, killed himself in a shootout with the cops. All of these other theories, they have to prove that somebody in that circle put that sheath into that room. And I think that's a high bar.
It is, but also keep in mind that you have the circumstantial evidence you have to bring in.
Yeah, good point.
And that helps support a case. It really does. It helps support the case. It may be circumstantial, but when you take it in the totality, along with the DNA, it helps support the case.
Yeah, no, great point. Great point. So let's get to some of these questions here. This one here, so great to have Francine here. Is the Kohberger case, in the Kohberger case, do you think they went directly to WGS or SMP instead of doing the STR first? How hard is it to get those types of profiles from touch DNA?
Well, I think they would have had to have, they could go to STR if they got enough, okay? But they're not going to take that chance if they didn't get enough, so they're going to go directly to the genetic DNA testing, because you don't want to use up all your sample. You don't want to use up so much you can't get results. So if they got an STR, which they very easily it could. In fact, I think that there was male DNA left on the sheath button, and I do think, I can't remember if I read about an STR, but the thing is, you can get an STR. Remember, I told you that you don't need as much DNA as you used to for traditional STR testing. So, for an example, what I use is filters, okay? And so usually they only will use half the filter, and they will process that, and they'll have some extract maybe left over, DNA extract, which they could put in to next generation sequencing. Unless you get a letter of consumption, we don't use the whole filter because you want to leave half for defense. And if you get a letter of consumption, and you usually get that from your district attorney, then you can use the whole thing, okay? Because sometimes you won't have enough DNA and you do have to use the whole filter to get what you want. But in answer to the question, I think more than likely what happens, let me just kind of explain this. So when you do DNA testing, there's some steps to it. And the first step you do, whether it's a swab, whether it's a filter, whether it's a cutting from an item of evidence, you take it to what's called quantitation, quant. And that tells you how much DNA you have. It tells you how much STR DNA you have. They call it autosomal DNA, human DNA, whatever. It's STR DNA, just to put it bluntly. It's the kind that goes in the database traditionally. And it'll also tell you how much male DNA is on there. Now, we don't know how many contributors or how many mixtures there are at that point, but you know how much you have at quantitation. So then you're going to make the decision at that point, which direction are we going to go? Are we going to go for genetic testing, or are we going to go for traditional STR or YSTR testing?
And I
told them to raise their hands in appreciation of you, and the whole crowd is.
Put your hand up. Francine is just the GOAT when it comes to DNA. Absolutely the GOAT. Okay, next question. Next question.
I just want to know if that was understood, though, that when you get the DNA extract, you have to make a decision at that point what type of testing you're going to do. And they obviously did that, and they made that decision.
Right. And Francine, it said in the news, I looked it up when you were just saying, it said law enforcement recovered trash from Kohberger's parents' home and used STR DNA analysis to compare it with the DNA found at the crime scene.
Okay, so STR.
So there you are. Yeah.
Okay.
And the nice thing about that is STR works better with mixtures. So you get some out of the trash, you probably have some mixtures.
Interesting.
Oh, just so the audience knows that they do have software that when you get STR DNA, you can unmix the mixtures. So you can unmix.
Wow.
Mixtures. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
You can separate them?
Mm-hmm.
That's so cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah, you can unmix them.
But Francine, how alike are you, let's say you and I, or Chris and I, how alike are we in terms of DNA profile?
Well, nobody shares the same DNA unless it's identical twins. Okay. Mm-hmm. And DNA are the building blocks of you. And that has to do with your genetics, your genealogy, all that other stuff that goes. You and I'm sure we're related someplace where Noah came from. I don't know. But we would not. That's why they put that, how many million or trillion, people it would be. The odds of that are this many.
So for that profile where it's like you can rule out 99.999%.
That's a lot. You could rule out.
Confident that whoever's DNA that is the child of this person. Yep. They took the. So I mean, that's going to be pretty hard to attack.
That is. Yeah.
I mean,
what they're trying to do, what defense is trying to do, is not argue the DNA belonging. They're arguing the sheath being planted.
It's going to be interesting, Chris, to see the armchair sleuths and podcasters that are going to try to attack Francine for saying that.
Hopefully not.
That's okay.
Okay, so let's go to the next question.
Good luck on that one.
Yeah. What's the panel's opinion, legality of genetic genealogy use, even through donor opted out of LEU? Certain specialists have found a backdoor and are doing this. Your thoughts? Here, go ahead, read that.
Yeah, let's see.
So if somebody has opted out for their genealogy, they're saying that somebody used a backdoor, and I'm assuming that's going to be the accusation of the FBI, just pulled it without somebody's permission.
Yeah, you can do that. It happens a lot. You can do it clandestinely where they don't know. You can do that. But one of the things about genealogical DNA is even if they opted out, you might have relatives that are opted in and then they kind of make a tree, a family tree, and try to find it. That's what happened in the Angie Dodge case. They had to get birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates to try to find the family tree of where to find this person. And it was like a needle in a haystack because they had a sample of this person's DNA from the get-go, but he wasn't in the database. And so that wasn't going to happen. And they put it into a genealogical database and it came up to a Michael Ussery, who they thought for sure it's him. And it didn't come up to him, but it came up to an Ussery name, a relative. And they said, he's probably one because he liked murderobilia. He made movies of stabbing people. And this is the guy, it's got to be the guy. But when they got him and they looked at his DNA, it was not him. And so who is it? We know his last name's Ussery. Where is he? And so they went and clandestinely got all these samples and everything else. And finally, after taking all that and building that family tree, they found a woman who had a child by a man named Ussery. She left him or divorced him and married someone else. And he adopted this person. His name was no longer Ussery. It was Drips. And it was like finding a needle in a haystack. So you have the DNA, but you can't find him. So you build a family tree.
Wow. That's cool. Here's a cool question. Can touch DNA transfer?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's called secondary transfer. Absolutely.
Okay, here's the next one. This is more of a comment. How do you explain the lack of DNA evidence in Kohberger's apartment office? How come is it to not find evidence there? And I think there may be evidence there, because it's in the search warrant that they found, something. They found some blood, like I mentioned earlier, on the pillow, on a comforter. Now, whether it belongs to the victims or not, we don't know that. It sounds like they're holding that back. And they're not gonna let everything out. I mean, they've got to hold things close to them because if they let out everything that they have done or the DNA what it rests on, it could ruin the case. And so they're not going to do that. And I understand that. So we're here just kind of like you say, we're doing the armchair stuff, saying this, but we're experts giving our opinion. And so there's reasons maybe why, and I'm just giving my opinion on what I would do, but they could be not giving information out because it's very critical information that they need for that case. Does brass degrade DNA?
Metals can, and it, like I said, when you use chemicals, to process the DNA, the ions in the metal can inhibit the DNA.
Okay. And I just saw one of the questions, could it be his own blood? Absolutely. From shaving or anything like that? Absolutely. We'll find out because they have it. They mentioned it. So that's a great comment. No real evidence. That's why it's gone to trial. I believe any DNA was planted and the knife sheath itself was a plant. And you know what? That's your opinion. That's good. It's good to have opinions. Mine is.
We have to look at both sides. I mean, we do, and that's what a trial is all about. You need to look at the evidence. You need to look at the circumstantial evidence. You need to look at the totality of everything.
Yep. Was anyone else's DNA found on the snap button? If you know, from your research so far, Francine.
I don't know.
Okay. How can one explain the lack of DNA evidence on, I think we've already read that, as claimed by the defense. How common is that? That is not uncommon.
No.
Would you guys agree?
Yeah, I would agree. Because number one, we don't know if the person who did this protected their car, took their clothes off, disposed of their clothes. I don't know if they did or not. I don't know what evidence is there. They know. I don't know. There's so many times they'll get rid of the weapon. They'll get rid of their shoes or clothing, everything that they possibly can. They have covered their car their car seats, where they sit down. They've been very meticulously made it, where they can't leave the DNA, because everything is covered, and they make sure they have a plan. I mean, this is planned out ahead of time.
Yep. So this one, the issue is IgG is that the FBI who worked the case may have used MyHeritage to get the match to Dad, which violates the TOS, not a crime, but bad optics and great material for the defense. Yep.
Well, on the Angie Dodge case, they had the suspect's DNA from the very get-go. And at that point in time, genealogical profiles were very rare. But Sorensen's Forensics started a database, which they later sold to Ancestry. So Ancestry, had all these things that came from the church that is predominant in Utah, and they had all this ancestry, and there was no policy or anything that nobody could anybody could search it, basically. So law enforcement did that, and there was a big issue about it. And then that is when it came out that you had to opt in to search the DNA. Okay, you had to opt in. And so if you go to GEDmatch, they have a thing that says, will you allow law enforcement to search your DNA? And so you say yes or no. If you say no, then they're not allowed to search that database. GEDmatch has the other database where they are allowed to search. So I don't know the issues about the FBI. I don't know what they did, but it was problematic to begin with Angie Dodge, but it went ahead and gave us a last name to start with. So it went ahead and we were able to get the killer.
Okay, so we've got this one's just more of a comment. Alternative theory: drug cartel kills victim because two of them mothers seem to have snitched on the cartel. Okay, for the cartels to get involved in something like this in small town Moscow, Idaho, you've got to be moving millions and millions of dollars of fentanyl. I mean, millions and millions, tens of millions of fentanyl. It's not because of a couple snitches that you're going to take out somebody's family. Go ahead.
But also the profiling on this, would probably tell this is a overkill. There's a lot of overkill here, and you don't usually see that a crime of passion like that unless you're really upset or mad, or that's, in my opinion. I'm not a profiler, but Gary, you could probably talk to that. But there's a lot of overkill there.
Yeah, Gary, do you want to weigh in on that thought?
I mean, I think that certainly that what was done would have been in excess to what was necessary to eliminate a person, unless there were an emotional or fantasy-based element there. I also find it very hard to believe that there wasn't a ferocious fight on the part of one or more of these young people.
There was.
I can't imagine that wasn't the case. Yeah, and he must have had, whoever killed them must have had some of their DNA on him at the time he left, even just in terms of I can imagine scratches or, Francine, did you ever get DNA from things like that where somebody has been attacked by the victim? And
I haven't, but I've taken photographs and we've gotten somebody and they have the scratches, and it's been a couple of days, 3 days after or whatever. But that's a good point. We have to learn that even though the body belongs to the medical examiner, swabbing those areas before it's transported or taken away for autopsy is a really good idea, whether it's a neck, whether it's scratches, teeth, if there's bite marks or something like that, that would be something when the medical examiner comes, you say, okay, I want to swab here, you can take photographs, whatever else, document that and do that, because I learned that late in the game when somebody was strangled, and had I thought of that, I would have swabbed the neck for touch DNA, because you'll have, of course, the victims, and then you'll have, somebody else's too. But that's something we should keep in mind.
Do you only deal with human DNA? Like, for example, I think there is some question of whether there was dog hair found in Kohberger's home, I think. I mean, do they look at DNA of dogs and things like that?
I think there are people that can, like, I think Bill Schneck, he can probably do something like that. I don't do that, but I do know, let's just put this out for everybody, that there are HOAs that charge if your dog poops on the lawn, and they can have a database that your dog's DNA, when you enter this HOA, they will get a database of your dog, and they'll go and swab that poop, because you don't want the whole poop sample. You just send somebody out to swab it, and then you put it through the database, and then you get fined $300 for letting your dog poop on the lawn. You didn't pick it up. So there is animal DNA stuff.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
This one's for you, Doc Gary. Opinion on the childhood profiles of, so to speak, the perpetrator who committed this crime.
Well, it's a little complicated because, first of all, there are different childhood trajectories in people who commit mass murder and individual murders, crimes of passion, and serial killing, and all kind. It depends on what kind of person we're talking about. And again, we're only in the realm of speculation here, but this was, technically speaking, a mass murder by any definition, right? 4 people killed in the same place at the same time. Even by the most conservative definition, there's a mass murder. But I think what makes this tricky, and you heard people like Greg Cooper and Dean Jackson and Ann Burgess and I say on the show with you, Chris, that this actually has more the look of a person who, if given the opportunity, probably would have progressed into serial killing. The motivation that appears to have been at play is a lot more like that than a person who just is emoting and picks up something and goes and kills a bunch of people, or spitefully plans to do that, and it's like a one-off situation, right? Because this seems so much more fantasy-based. And if that's true, what we know about the childhoods of people who go on to do this is that there tends to be something in their lives that leaves them feeling that there is a unfairness in the world, that they are being rejected by a group of people or a type of person or whatever. And there is a kind of a fantasy-based world in which they are leveling the playing field by hurting individuals like that, eliminating them, whatever. And you generally wind up with what I've called, in my own work, I've called a prototype, which is like the original source of anger, right? And now you go out and you cast, like a casting agent, you look for people who fit the part of that original person, and they become a surrogate victim that you play it out on, or an object of intense fixation. It could be that the person only needs to be female. It could be that the person needs to be a petite female. It could be they have to have a particular type of hair. It could be that they have to be, very pretty, physically attractive. They could have a certain weight, etc. And, the idea is that you can bet that if there's ever a confession in this case, and this is the type of person that if he's guilty, I think would then like to talk a great deal about his inner world because he knows everybody wants to know about it. I think we're going to get a story like that about how, he was kind of hurt by the world, rejected, couldn't figure people out, was kind of weird, angry, especially at women. And I think you're going to hear something along the lines of, in my effort to figure out how to make people like me, I tried everything in the world. I lost a lot of weight. I got that TA position. I tried to be the smartest one in the room. I tried to, yada, 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 and nothing worked. I was just weird. Nobody wanted me, etc. And that's why I think it's interesting to think about that TA position as a kind of an outlet for that desire to have some control over people, especially women, that he was grading reportedly a lot harsher than males. The potential for losing it would have been like a little bit of a trigger for somebody like that, because and then imagine if a person at the same time that's going on has some object of intense fixation and knows everything about that person and feels there's an intimacy with that person and the whole thing, and then they suddenly feel you're powerless, you're insecure, nobody wants you, you're garbage, whatever. you can imagine them then going and having to assert that over. So I think you're going to get some kind of story like that. There is a disproportionate amount of negative stuff in the histories of people who do this. There are a smattering of people who didn't really have any bad histories that just seem to be bad seed, so to speak. But most of them, you need some environmental stuff that's interacting with whatever is going on in the brain of this kind of person that becomes the fire to the straw. I mean, that's actually a really interesting question for you, Francine. I mean, there's no evidence that I'm aware of that there are genes to be a serial killer. We have no evidence of that at all. Like the child of a serial killer became a killer or whatever, right? I mean, the siblings can be totally unaffected. It looks environmental mixed with some genetic potentially. Yeah. What do you think?
I think psychology is the one that would have to come up with, that type of statistical idea, not DNA.
Yeah. But I guess what I'm saying is the notion of bad seed is. I mean, what I could envision is that that psychopathy. Being a psychopath may have a genetic component in the sense that you may have abnormalities of frontal lobe, the amygdala, limbic circuitry of the brain. You could, have problems with empathy and fear and attention and all those kinds of things. But I think that if you had that kind of brain and you were treated well by the world, you might not apply it in a violent way. It might be a mixture of those.
Well, yeah, like you said, Gary, though, that there's some sort of trauma that could have happened in their life. When we think of trauma, we think it's something huge, but it could be something very small. It could be something very minute that really affected them at a certain point in their life. And how they act out and they build it up as they go on in their life, adds to that. So, yeah, I mean, I think that, who knows, someday you might just be able to figure that out. I don't know, but.
Right.
And we did a show on this right here where we had Victor and Ann on, where we talked about just what this comment here, the MMPI and just the questions, et cetera. Here's another one for you, Dr. Brucato. Let's see here. Where'd it go? Here it is. When Brian left with his father to go back east, they took a much longer route south to Colorado, another Bundy site. That's interesting.
The whole thing is that, I mean, again, let me be clear. This is just a kind of intellectual curiosity, not anything that's being proposed as a realistic hypothesis at this point. But yeah, look, I think there is certainly a question of what the heck went on in that car. I mean, they took a long route, and it is fascinating to imagine what the father and son talked about on that ride. And the other thing I can't seem to get a clear answer on, I hear all different. Some people say it's not true, it was misreported. Some people say it's absolutely true. Is the question on whether it is real that his family saw him bleaching the car. Now, if that turns out to be true, I mean, that's pretty problematic.
It's that he's wearing gloves, that he's taking his trash to the neighbors at his house in Pennsylvania, right? I mean, the FBI is on a surveillance, and I know they took photographs of him, because if you're on a surveillance, that's what you're doing. And they see him cleaning the car with gloves on, and they see him take his trash to his neighbor's trash can and dispose of it, and that's where they went and they grabbed it.
As if they weren't going to be able to figure out that, watch him for 2 seconds to figure out. But Francine, what does bleach do to DNA?
Oh, bleach can destroy DNA.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and he would have potentially researched that.
He would probably research that, but I think that I don't know what kind of fabric his car is. I have no idea. So would it damage it? Could you tell? You could probably figure that one out. And if there was, I do know that I have done cars before, and they think they've cleaned them up pretty good, but they don't seem to be able to get into those little seams and nooks and crannies. They tend to think they've really done it, but sometimes it just doesn't work out. I did want to say there is a question for Dr. Bardole. Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome.
I am not a DNA analyst. What I do is I extract the biological material or the skin cells or the DNA, whether it's semen, sperm, or whatever it is, off the item of evidence. I extract it. I just know enough after all the years I've worked with DNA and worked with law enforcement to, in their own language, be able to explain what is going on and what the lab reports say and what the steps are. And so I just wanted to make that clear. So my expertise is to get the DNA off of the item of evidence. When I'm done with that, I send it to an accredited lab, the best lab that I can find for whatever evidence I have, to process the filters and get the DNA. Also, what I do is I keep very close touch with the laboratory person to make sure where we're at and what the quant is, how much we have, and if we follow along the lines, and I do that for them as well, so they have a clear understanding what's happening. So if we're at quant and we don't have enough to move forward, then we won't go to the testing part, and we'll hang on to that until something better comes along.
Yep.
Well, so, go ahead, Chris.
No, and just, for the record, Francine, as humble as she is, this isn't her first rodeo, and she created the method of extraction. So I just love how she plays herself down. It's fascinating, and this is a point here that we all talked about early on with Greg and myself, et cetera, about that car, before the killing, where the underwear was moved and stuffed in the door, et cetera, et cetera. Man, those are huge red flags that I really hope the authorities, even at that time, have gone back to that situation and reevaluate it, because to me, as an investigator, I would have not taken that off the table.
Well, my hypothesis, Chris, is that if he was responsible for that, part of the reason for it was to spook the women living in the house into getting cameras, which could then be manipulated to watch them.
Yeah, that's the other thing, right? Remember his neighbor, where she's like, getting creeped out that there's something going on, and he volunteers to go in there and, set up a surveillance system for her.
But he's allegedly the one that went in and moved the objects that led to her wanting the camera.
That was the theory, right?
So what's been said in the media, but I think, the idea might have been, you could see it two ways. You could see it as like a fledgling kind of quasi-sexual offense in a person that's building, like fueling a fantasy, or you could view it as a mechanism to frighten the women in that nearby home into getting a camera.
Well, and that's why I think it's fascinating in one of the search warrants that they bring in this network intrusion expert and network intrusion company to review some of the stuff that they discovered, probably on his laptop. So I will not be surprised if we don't hear evidence at some point. We've not seen it yet, but we've seen the search warrants. I will not be surprised if we don't hear testimony from intrusion experts that say, yes, it is possible somebody was sitting outside and had tapped into the networks, et cetera. And if they do, if that person did that, then they may have access to the cameras going on in that house. Those girls could have a laptop or a desktop in their rooms, or they could have had a smart TV and not even aware that there was a creeper watching everything that they would do.
Studying
them.
Right.
Yeah.
And Chris, that was his specialty area. Remember, he tried to volunteer with law enforcement to help them learn how to do it.
Exactly.
Exactly. But when we get a hold of this guy's search history on his devices, there are four things I'm looking for, right? One is, what was his sexual fantasy life? Pornography, etc. What kind of stuff was he looking, if anything? Secondly, was he studying means of surveillance? Right, that I'm really, really interested, right? And third, I want to know if he was studying other serial killers, offenders, the things they did, right? And fourth, I'm curious if he was looking up ways to destroy evidence. And, now he would have been probably too savvy to sort of stupidly Google things like, how do you destroy DNA and things like that. But I just feel like this guy is the type that would say, what? I'm a criminology student. I was just studying it, right? I mean, I always joke that I used to say to Michael Stone, I can't write that chapter because I'd have to Google it. And I don't want to Google that stuff, Michael. Let's not do that. It's too weird, right? And but it's possible, Chris, that all that stuff is going to be there. And I also think, I guess I'd add as a fifth, is how much looking was he doing at the social media profiles of these people, right? Because I think all that stuff, the videos of the inside of the house, the dog, the whole thing, that's like surveillance to an offender. I mean, you could watch a person's TikTok and learn a very great deal about the inside of their house. I mean, there are TikTok influencers, or whatever you would call them. I can't say I have too much use for the whole lot of them, but there are influencers that if I were to meet them after having viewed so much of the stuff they post, I would literally know what their home looks like. Like I'd be like, oh, that's interesting. There's a bathroom over there. I've seen it, and I just feel like that's dangerous. People don't realize how much information they're giving. Don't you think, Chris?
Oh, 100%. And that's why even today, I mean, I still scratch my head why they tore this house down. I am just so nervous that the family is going to be sitting in the courtroom looking at the jury, and the jury's looking at all these horrendous, pictures, et cetera, inside the house. And then there's going to be this big question of surveillance that comes up, right? All of a sudden, there's going to be a whole line of where the prosecution's going to go. We've got his car here. We've got his car here. We've got the cellular, data here. We've got this, problems, things we don't even know about at the university, right? At Washington State University. I mean, for all we know, he was doing other things over there, and they've gathered that intel as well. We just haven't seen it yet. Okay. And then to think there could be just one juror, just one, who says, you know what? I wanted to see the house. And, I can tell you, I have had those aha moments, sitting in the courtroom. I've shared this with my audience in the past. We had a 3-defendant case, 3 juries. We had 45 jurors in the courtroom. Okay. I was on the stand, I think 4.5, almost 5 days in a murder trial testifying.
Wow.
In between the breaks, right, as the jury was leaving, I don't know what it is in my life, but I smiled. I'm sitting in the courtroom like this, just smiling. Okay. Even Nancy Grace the other day says to me, McDonough, would you stop smiling, please? We're talking about murders. Okay. But you guys know me. I'm just an optimist. I'm just that kind of person. And I don't know what happened. Long story short, one of the jurors, right, looks at the defense, and the defense says, after they're out, Your Honor, I noticed the defense attorney, and there were 6 of them. I noticed Detective McDonough was smiling at one of our jurors. I want to voir dire the jury to see if he's influencing the jury. Okay. And the judge looks at me and goes, and makes this general statement. He says, well, that's just Detective McDonough. That's his personality. He's been sitting in the courtroom for, whatever it was. He smiles at everybody. Okay. And anyway, they had a voir dire. They excused me into the hallway. They brought all 45 jurors back in and asked them if my smiling influenced them in their decision against the defendants. And the funny part of this whole thing was one of the jurors said, no, okay, that, Detective McDonough, he's just there. We got it, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, and this was told to me by the DA later, he leans forward and he points at one of the defendants and says, but that guy right there has been staring at our women in the jury. Okay. Well, of course, he got dismissed almost instantaneously. And one of the, the extras was put in. But that's the kind of thing when I heard the house was going away, I thought to myself, oh my gosh, what about them?
Yeah.
What about them? It just takes one, absolutely one. So I've got a couple more questions here. There's only 3 more. I've had you guys for 2 hours and 20 minutes, and I hope you're still okay. Are we good here?
Yeah.
I think we need Francine to come back to talk about the Heuermann DNA.
Oh,
That's
yes.
a whole other show.
To talk about what?
The Rex Heuermann case.
Rex Heuermann DNA.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole other. We could have, But
Okay.
Yeah.
It says, if we promise not to tell, heard they're using MVAC in the Ramsey case, asking for a friend, wink, wink.
I don't know if they did or not. I know that I did look at it. People have asked me about what would I, what would I process? And I did say, because she was strangled with a garrote that they used, I think it was a paintbrush or something to twist it around. And that was a wooden paintbrush handle. And I thought I'd use the Bardole method on that for sure. But as far as the other stuff, I have no idea. But if they did, and it comes to pass, we find out, I say, yay, I'm glad that they did, because that is a good forensic tool to use. Swabbing simply cannot get enough space or area to give you what you need.
Okay, and this one up in the air for either one says, what if BK, this is more of a comment, what if BK was so fascinated with the woman found in the park that he thinks that TB committed that crime, Ted Bundy committed that crime, and that's why he went to the park? Gary?
I don't know. I only know that if he is guilty and he's anything like the types of offenders that came before him, we are going to discover that there are certain offenders whose methods he would have studied. For example, if it's true that he used a ruse like looking like a helper, and by the way, remember the line in the house, I'm here to help, if that thing of looking like a helper that then sabotages the person, that's a technique that was used by Zodiac, for example, go ahead. What'd you say, Francine?
Ted.
Well,
Ted
yeah,
Bundy.
that's I need your help right. I need your help to help me with the putting the sailboat on top because my arms hurt, whatever. But there are glimmers there that make me think of certain offenders that this guy might have been interested in. But if Kohberger is guilty, I think of him as like a category 16 in my book, which is the type of person who in the commission of an offense, whether there's a sexual component or not, and they don't tend to be, by the way, category 16s don't tend to be overtly sexual. The motivation is a lot more about wanting to be a mastermind. It's the ego. The ego drive is in many ways more important. I mean, that's the category where we would put Zodiac, the Unabomber, people like that. And it's interesting.
Do you think BK falls into this with
I think if he killed
presentation? Do you think there's a lot going on behind the scenes with him and the attorneys?
BK?
Yeah, Brian.
In what sense? You mean when you say behind the scenes? What do you mean?
Well, you're saying he's a category 16.
Yeah,
so
I think if he's guilty, that's what I think. Yeah, that's the type that would manipulate everything, the whole narrative to the public, what the lawyers do, everything is for effect. Because the whole idea is that because you're trying to reduce everything to a science, that's how you would think about things.
An alphabet of new evil. I love that chapter, by the way.
Oh,
right? Chapter 16.
Oh, the category. Yeah. That's where I think he would fall. And it's important because what it would tell us is that a big part of the question of why, it means that there'd be some kind of colossal wound to the ego, and then using this manipulation of the public and of the narrative and so forth to kind of have fun, in one's mind, being the center of attention. So that's why it drives me crazy that the whole world is talking about this guy. I think it's just feeding this colossal ego, and which of course is really a small ego, but a seemingly colossal that expands and deflates depending upon how people are talking about the person. So
what I thought was fascinating is the defense did a survey.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what he did in his thesis, right? I mean, he did a survey out into the environment to all these, hypotheses about killing and how to get away with it. And then all of a sudden the defense comes up, and I have it right here, by the way. I have the survey, not his. I have that one too. But this one is, 3 words, blame the media, was the survey. And in here, she gives no explanation of media stories, but they are inaccurate and misleading. But she gives no explanations what that means. Logistics is not a reason for change of venue. The surveys show that the logistics of flying into a smaller airport would be, quite challenging, okay, for the news media and the public, et cetera. Well, that is not a reason for a change of venue. Politics is not a reason for the change of venue. She blames Moscow Police Chief Fry, who's running for the Latah County Sheriff. And if he wins, there could be a conflict of interest, she notes, in the latest motion, et cetera. And anyway, the list goes on, and I'm going to have another show about that in of itself. But I think he's behind the scenes pulling the strings.
That type always does. If he is that type, that you can expect it. Saying, in fact, you can almost imagine that kind of person, even when committing the crime, saying, "If I get caught, I will use these pings as a way to argue that I couldn't have been there, right? Or I'll turn the phone on here and shut it off there, so that'll be my defense." It's exactly the kind of defense you'd expect from somebody with his areas of expertise. And but that's why I think, Chris, the search history is going to be very illuminating, because this guy is a researcher. So what was he looking up? And I think once we see that, remember when we got the search history on Horomon?
Yeah.
Look, innocent until proven guilty, but the search history is pretty damning. It's like, I think people sometimes in the intimacy of their homes, when they're Googling or looking up pornography or whatever, they just forget for a second that there's really no privacy about it, that a whole record is being kept, that somebody could, it's kind of amazing to me. And that we think we have privacy on these, it's unbelievable. This is like a tracking device, and it listens to you, it's like, so I just, that amazes me. And I think there's a kind of arrogance that you start to get.
And I know Cy personally from ZedX. I used to see him at conferences all the time. And what the public needs to remember is he was only giving one layer of the cake, okay, i.e. the, cell phone data, positioning of the towers, et cetera. But in his testimony, he also said, I don't have all the data. And that's where the second layer of that comes in with, much more deeper involvement with companies. One of them I would encourage people to go look up. I've said this 100 times, but it's really important, is a company called Gladiator Forensics. Okay. You won't get past one side of the wall, but you'll be able to see some of the things that they do. That is the second layer that unfortunately ZedX did not have access to. And that's why he kept it open during his testimony. That, there could be more information. I'm just not seeing it yet. And so just keep that in mind, everybody, that you're not completely wrapping your mind around, that particular expert yet, because, he could be shown, unfortunately, additional data, and he could actually come around and say, this is the stuff I needed to see. It's kind of like when if you were to put Francine on the stand and just kind of show her a piece of the DNA and not give her all of it, of course her opinion's going to be, well, yeah, this is valid, okay, but I need to see more. And that's what the expert said. And so there you go, right there. here's the answer. He reserves the right to change his mind if the defense shares their evidence. Unfortunately, they admit they didn't create results that can be duplicated. There you go. So that's the point that I think the public also needs to pay attention to before we go down that rabbit hole completely, because it's never the way it looks. And here's another point here. This is more of a statement. Thanks, Nick. Look up Lucas Anderson, his DNA, but he wasn't there because he was in a hospital. So it's possible the sheath got the DNA randomly. It's always possible, but then again, we look at the totality of the evidence, and the circumstantial totality could for sure be problematic for the defense, so just always continue to keep that in your minds, in all of our minds, as we watch this, because this is going to be one of those trial of the centuries. Would you guys agree with that?
Because if he's guilty, it's precisely the kind of person who would want it to be. That when I look at the way the public reacts to him, again, if he's the one who did it, isn't it interesting the way that there are people out there worshiping him, in love with him, sending love letters to him, defending him, like elevating him to the status of a religious icon, practically. There are websites where people or social media sites where people are making loving illustrations of him with hearts and animals on him and the whole thing. That's the kind of thing you see when a person has a personality that requires that people elevate them and talk about them and play. It's like what you see in people that have been very narcissistic core.
Do you see any correlations with Charles Manson?
Well, Charles Manson is a very different kind of character. Charles Manson had more the personality structure of a person who wanted other people to do offensive things for him, to assert control over them, and who really studied how to look deranged, but he was a total psychopath who had that weird quality because he was a drug user and so forth. But he was basically a psychopath, and who learned, for example, Charles Manson studied how to manipulate people and influence them, and he would read like Carnegie and people like that. And he learned that if you stare at people and don't blink, it'll give you a very mystical quality, right? Remember the movie that came out in the 70s, Jesus of Nazareth, with Robert Powell? Remember that fantastic miniseries that like every famous person in it? Well, one of the cool factoids I learned about that movie is that the actor who played Christ learned that basically from Manson, that if you don't blink, it'll make you seem really mystical. And through the entire movie, he doesn't blink.
Wow. And
the thing is, it works. If when you talk to a person, you don't blink like that, it gives them the feeling that you're like otherworldly, like that you're like a transmitter of a heavenly message or something. And Manson knew that. That's the opposite of Kohberger. If he's guilty, is somebody who wants to assert control over people, but he stinks at it. He stinks on ice. That's the whole thing. On his best day, he was too weird. So what does a person like that do? They say, fine, then I'll just assert power over you, because if I can't have you, and that's why I think it's so symbolic to go in when somebody's sleeping and when they don't have to look at you and you're in the darkness or whatever. Because if somebody looked at him, they'd be like, you're pathetic. Like, why am I? So you do it when the person can't see you and when they're caught off guard. And that's what's so ugly about it, right? That thing of a person not even standing a chance, right? So, but Francine, I hope that we didn't bore you too much with all of these exercises in psychology going on.
I like them. I like them.
Well, I hope they sound worthwhile to you. But I love the scientific quality of your brain, and how you just stick to the facts. And I have to tell you, I don't think you even need to get into motive in this case. I feel like this case is going to be decided on things like DNA, phone pings, whatever. And Chris, how much does motive even matter in this story?
Well, it doesn't. It's always like, you have the pool in the backyard, and then you have these wet footprints going into the house. The question is always, did somebody get out of the pool? Okay. And this is what this kind of case is. That's exactly what it is. They're seeing the wet footprints on the concrete, the sun hasn't come out yet, and somebody's taken picture of the wet footprints and said, we have wet footprints coming out of the pool. Okay. And then you go into the house and there's a pair of trunks there and they're wet, but nobody's connected to them. And then they find out, okay, well, who bought these trunks? Where'd they come from?
Yeah.
Et cetera. And this is what we're going to write. This is what we're writing about, even with, the Tabor caper. I think this is right down that line.
You mean in the book we're
Yeah.
doing? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll tell you, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, as I say, there is a reason motive matters, though. It matters because the jury needs to understand that if they were to acquit a certain type of person, what they would be capable of doing again. Because remember, if you're talking about a person who is motivated by something that is temporary and kind of circumstantial, and they just act out, that kind of person might experience remorse and never do it again. But if a person is motivated in the way a serial killer is, the idea would be to do it again until you get the fantasy right. And the jury needs to understand that experts don't look at Kohberger and say, this looks like somebody who would commit a one-off. If this guy's guilty, this looks like somebody that you would want to not allow another chance. So that's why I think the motive matters. But from a technical perspective, no. But I have to say, though, having talked about it out loud with Francine, I find myself feeling that they're going to have a really hard time defending this. I just can't see how you get around a DNA profile like that in that room, and him being in a park. It's just, I don't get it.
What do you think, Francine?
I agree. Well, because you're talking to the jurors, and you've got just regular people there that are listening to this, and when you present the evidence, they have to make that determination of how important that was and does it stand up. And so, on however the attorneys, defense and prosecution, present that case, and how the experts present that case to the jury is going to be very, very important. And that includes, like I said, and Chris, you said the same thing, the totality of everything. They have to take everything in. They can't just look at the sheath and say, oh, no, then it's not him. They have to take the totality of everything. All I'm saying is the more scientific evidence you have, the stronger the case.
Yeah.
Love it.
What do you think, Chris? Pretty damning case?
I think, you know what? It's all going to be in the presentation and in the order of it. How all of this evidence is going to be presented before a jury. Remember, we already see the theme that the defense has come up with so far, right? We've seen a theme that they've been able to manipulate around the gag order by utilizing motions. Okay. They've been able to, they haven't said a word to the press, but they've written a lot of motions. And those motions are all public record. And it's created this whole new, conversation, which is brilliant, in my opinion, from the defense. I mean, it was a good move. Okay. I think my concern is the house is gone. Again, I know I lean back on that, but my experience has shown me, you just get that one person that says, I'd like to do a scene visit. They're very rare, but they are very effective. And that one case that I cited earlier, we took all 45 jurors out to the location. And man, that just sealed the deal. It was over. I think we're going to hear, or we're going to see video evidence. We're going to hear audio evidence, because I think some of those video cameras nearby the house captured some of that. It's leaked out, that there's been, some things heard on those cameras. That's going to be very powerful for a jury. You're going to see the crime scene photographs. You're going to see the FARO information, which is a 3D, recreation of the scene. It never, ever is the same as taking a jury where they can smell it, see it, feel it. But it is, we're in the 21st century. They're going to have to put it on. And then they're going to see the victims' families in the courtroom. And every single day, the victim's family is going to be looking at those jurors, and those jurors are going to say, could that have been my child? And if so, what's my responsibility? And I really believe this jury is going to take this responsibility so serious, okay, that I don't think we're going to have a whole bunch of people saying, I want to get out of this. So the voir dire process, when they pick them, is going to be critical. But the defense, I think, has already laid a couple of pieces of the puzzle out there that they're afraid of. They're afraid of the DNA. They're afraid of the social media. They're afraid of, the house, because they signed off right away. Yep, no problem. Tear it down. Okay. But I think once those crime scene photographs present themselves in a courtroom, this nation is going to be frozen with just grief. If folks are watching that trial, it's not like, the kooks, right? No, like the Vallows and the nut jobs, those guys out there, right? These are 4 innocent kids, and I call them kids because my youngest is 20, and my youngest, or my third son, as you guys know, I lost him. He died in 2003. His life stopped that day, September 3rd, 2003. He is 20 years old forever in my mind, in eternity. And I told Karen the other day, because I kind of had a moment with Dylan, who's 20. It killed me, because I thought to myself, I was so scared. I'm so scared of this year, this whole year of 20 years old. And man, when I saw these 4 kids, I thought to myself, oh my gosh, I know exactly where this family is. I just know exactly where this family is, because their lives have stopped. And I think a jury's going to feel that in the courtroom. They're going to feel it. And I think Steve and Kaylee's family and Ethan's family, they're dealing with it differently, every one of them. But Gary, I mean, you talk to families all day long.
With the obsession with who it is that shares the offender's DNA, we've forgotten who shares the victims.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, you get what I'm saying? I mean, we've completely forgotten them. And these people, in waiting around for this trial, it's adding to the pain. I mean, how many Christmases are going to have to go by that they have to look at an empty chair, before they can say, well, at least there's closure.
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing. I mean, people forget about the empty chair, right? At the table, that kind of thing. I mean, you know it, Chris. I've seen it. Francine, I'm sure you've had a loss in your life, and you know that feeling. And then imagine, that you're going to have to go into the courtroom and open the wound again and see the photos from the crime scene maybe, and look at this person that you think did it and the whole thing. You don't want to close it off because you're going to have to open it again when the trial happens. So you're sitting there stewing in it. God knows what. I mean, going to therapy, having nightmares, who knows? So I just feel like the longer it gets dragged out, the crueler it is. And then you have the fact that even for the accused's family, there's the pain of someone you love being accused and sitting in a jail cell, and what are they schlepping back and forth to Idaho from Pennsylvania? I mean, the whole thing for so many people is awful on so many levels, and those are the ripple effects of evil. The ripple effects of these offenses.
Well, you're right, Gary. There's 2 families.
Yeah,
but I mean, there's the victims' families, and there's the Brian's family, and I can only imagine, what they're going through, and what the victims' families are going through is they're wanting answers. They're wanting to know why, who, and why.
Exactly, and the trial of the century, because this guy is supposedly so interesting. I mean, I feel like I don't even want to call him by his name. I mean, if this guy's guilty, I mean, the idea that we have to use his name, it bothers me because it's like it means that he might have achieved precisely what he set out to do, and I feel like it's much more important to hammer home the names of the victims, and that's why I want to emphasize that even though the work you do, Francine, it might sound academic and scientific and so forth. The fact of the matter is, it is catching people before they kill people again. It is literally saving people's lives. In one way or another, all of us are doing something that uses science and facts to save lives. And so, I mean, what you said, Chris, we forget that.
And one thing that I want to add is things are going to get better scientifically. I have no doubt. I mean, things have been moving so fast when it comes to DNA and science. I just wish I could be around forever to see where that, where it caps, because it's getting so good, and it's just a matter of time, and it's going to get better and better. And I think we're going to be able to get a hold of things, and I think this can even get to the point where DNA isn't going to be the issue. It's going to be so easy to get, it's going to be so easy to produce and not produce, but to detect and get.
That's why the serial killers are declining, because they're getting caught after the first offense.
Yeah.
And now it's much more common to commit a mass murder, get it out of your, to do it once and then, go out in a blaze, because you're just not going to be able to perpetrate a series that easily. And because of people like you. So, but Chris, we have people in the audience saying, are we as a group able to accept the possibility that he could be innocent?
Of course we are. That's our job, is not to investigate people, it's to investigate information. And no matter where that information takes you, the first thing you need to do is eliminate exculpatory evidence, meaning you have to accept it. And you have to say, okay, could this be, something that shows that this person didn't do the crime? Every investigator on the earth has an obligation to do that. Because think of it this way. If this individual, let's hypothesize, right? Let's take, I see right here, Nick. And Nick, great question. I can accept if he did this and they have footage of him there, okay? Right. And then the other side of that coin is there's nothing worse than getting fonged or getting Mark Furmaned, okay? Think about what Mark Furman has gone through since the O.J. Simpson trial. Okay? That guy's life was destroyed by the public. It was destroyed by the public. Okay? And now you watch these documentaries of F. Lee Bailey saying, I knew I had him. Okay? And now think about that. Just look at the damage that occurred from, there was no question that DNA was not planted in any way, shape, or form. But he had the dream team, and that's what they call them, the defense dream team. Okay? And OJ walked. And every single day that he walked, that family suffered. Nicole's family suffered. Everybody suffered. Up until the day OJ died. And now they're all coming out and saying, yeah, he did it. Okay. So that's why it's important to step back and say, if there's exculpatory evidence, then of course you present that. Do I think the cops woke up that day and decided, you know what? We got 4 dead college students over in Moscow at the University of Idaho, which is going to destroy their reputation for a very long time. It's going to destroy 8 parents, because 4 times 2 is 8, grandparents, cousins, family members, etc. You know what? At me as a cop, I'm going to throw Brian Kohberger's DNA into the crime scene just to kind of mix it up. Okay. You ever watch the movie Spaceballs, where Rick Moranis goes ludicrous speed, okay, and press the button, okay? That's a Spaceball moment, in my opinion. Okay?
Right.
Okay. And so now, if you get there and you have 500 DNA things, then you have an explanation for it, i.e., is this a party house? Is this there? Is this that? Okay. But you don't kind of go off onto these wild tangents, because the investigator also gets to press play and see a white Hyundai come up that road there. Here's a question for folks. Okay. What are the odds of him driving a white Hyundai, and they have a white Hyundai on video? Somebody explain how that can't be. Because, see, that's the opposite. Okay. Because as an investigator, and if I'm looking at the information, I say, well, does he have another car? No, he's only got the white Hyundai. Okay, well, that's a problem. That could be a problem. Common sense, right? Ludicrous speed. Okay. And then what are the 12 times, the pings in the neighborhood? And then just that night, he happened to go stargazing, but I'll just turn my phone off. Okay. I'll just turn it off. Okay. What are the odds of that? Okay. Just that night in of itself. Now you see those opposites, right? Because opposites attract information in an investigation. You get opposites. It's the investigator's responsibility to say, okay, well, what's the reason for that? Why did you turn your phone off? Okay. Do we know if they sat down with Brian and said, we noticed your phone was off. Can you tell us why? If we don't have that answer yet into the public, then guess what? It's still on the table. It's still on the table as consciousness of guilt. It's one footprint leaving the swimming pool. The car is the second footprint leaving the swimming pool. And now we get into the DNA. It's the third footprint leaving the swimming pool. Okay? And we get the video of the car coming into the neighborhood is the fourth footprint leaving the swimming pool. And then we get 12 footprints through digital analysis. So now we've got, let's just hypothesize, we got 30 footprints coming from the swimming pool. Okay, well, show me why he's not in the swimming pool. Just don't talk about it. Show me why he's not in there. I need to know. I'm an investigator. I'm looking for information. I'm not looking at Brian Kohberger. I'm looking at the footprints coming out of the swimming pool and correlating them, just so happen to be his behavior. Okay. So show me his behavior that he didn't do it outside of somebody else's behavior that says, yada, yada. Okay. So that in of itself, yes. Can I walk down the middle? That's what I do for a living. I mean, Gary, Francine, I do that every single day. I actually work murders every day. Okay. Meaning I just interviewed a guy on Friday in jail. I was just in the jail with him. Okay. Talking to him. And so I get it, but I didn't go in the jail and say, you know what, today I'm of the frame of mind. I'm just going to drop something in here and throw him under the bus. Okay. I think law enforcement gets a bad rap today with social media, as powerful as it is. And because I went through that with Michael Crow and the Crow case. I think the public forgets I was the only guy that said Richard Tuitt is not your guy. And the DA, Paul Finks at the time, and I'm not going to go down this road tonight, but the DA came to me and said, what do you mean? I said, well, the most important witness had never been interviewed. And he looks at me and he goes, what are you talking about, Chris? And I said, Paul, the dog. He goes, what do you mean? Break it down. And I said, think about it. You have the mother, the victim, the sister, the brother, the grandfather or the grandparents, and a dog in a house. You have a schizophrenic who is like Pigpen from Charlie Brown, leaving a trail of dust behind him. In fact, they even contact him that night and get his clothing. Okay. I said, you know what they didn't find on that clothing? Because he's in that house allegedly for 15 to 18 minutes. He goes, what? I said, dog hair. He's wearing a wool sweater. But now you have a criminalist by the name of George Durgan who testifies in trial that he cross-contaminated the guy's clothing. Okay. And guess what? Not guilty. The jury walked him, which was the right decision. So I speak from experience and authenticity about being down the middle. Okay. I can tell you a lot of guys that have killed people, but they're not in jail because I didn't have enough evidence to take them to prison. Okay. And that's my job, to present the evidence and be right down the middle, no matter what it is, good or bad. And that's Francine's job. We've both been in that game for quite some time. I started this in 1982. So it's 42 years now in this game. It's not my first rodeo. And I've walked a lot of people that I wish I could have put in jail.
Yeah, but I'd be willing to bet, Chris, that Francine has worked on cases where DNA was used to exonerate people that were accused unfairly. In other words, it's an even. We're scientists. The way we're thinking about it is we just have a hypothesis. We explore the evidence. If it doesn't work, you come up with another hypothesis. There's no dog in the fight where we want someone to be guilty or something like that. It's just we're just interested in the facts, and so I think right now the preponderance of evidence leans a certain way. But of course, it's possible that will turn out to be some other explanation, as weird as it is. But right now, I mean, I think we're hypothesizing, a certain way.
Well, I don't need to hypothesize. That's the nice thing.
Yeah, you are more scientific.
I don't decide. And this is the truth. I rarely research a case before I do the evidence. The only time I do is when it's presented and I can see the crime scene and we talk about the crime scene. But I don't have to have a hypothesis because I get the evidence. And it's like I said, it's up to the investigator, it's up to everybody else to make that decision based upon, what I have gotten and the other evidence that's been, collected, substantial or whatever. I don't have to come up with a hypothesis. And I like that.
Here's always the key, right? Every victim leaves their impression, their impression of the suspect. Every murder I've ever worked, I've always looked at the victim and asked them in reverence, where do I go? Okay. I can't tell you, I know as weird as that sounds, okay, and then I listen. And I can tell you that every victim has left evidence about the perpetrator that took them off of the earth. Now, whether or not we catch it as investigators is a different story. But I know, Francine, you know this as well. It was divine inspiration that you have pulled DNA off of shell casings, off of rocks, off of all kinds of stuff. Okay. I personally have had personal experiences where you have sat there and you've studied the room, you've studied the victimology, you've come to know who that person was and is. And then all of a sudden you get this inspiration of thought out of nowhere. And it tells you that the universe is on schedule. Okay? If Brian Kohberger is not the guy, the universe will reveal that. There's no question in my mind. But if he is the guy, okay, hypothetically, start thinking about the victims. Okay? Spend as much time thinking about the victims and see what they show you versus always about, Hurman or, Brian or anybody else. Okay. Or look at Lacey Peterson. Lacey Peterson was found in a lake, at the bottom of the lake, sunk. Okay. Pregnant with a baby. And guess what? Scott Peterson was in the news yesterday. about a new duct tape. They want DNA off of a duct tape. Well, you know what? Lacey doesn't get an opportunity to say, hey, what about me? Over here. Hello. What about me? Over here. Okay. So let's kind of have a paradigm shift in society for a moment, and let's be down the middle, and let's look at the information. And if the information shows that Brian was somewhere else, great, then we accept that. But right now it's showing he's over here. Why is that so difficult to grasp sometimes? And so, you know what? It is what it is. There's conspiracies at every corner. Life is too short. Life is too short because right now those parents are only thinking about one thing. Their children stopped that day in November. Their life stopped. And so did the family's life. I'm 21 years into the death of my son. Okay? And this year, our youngest son, who is also 20 now, because he died in 2003. Ryan was 20 years old in 2003. And now Dylan, and by the way, Karen was 4 months pregnant with Dylan when Ryan died. So on one side of the coin, we're picking out a crib, and on the other side of the coin, we're picking out a coffin for our 20-year-old son. And yet Karen gives birth to Dylan today. And Dylan is now 20 years old. And this year has been heck for me mentally, because I'm just so worried, okay, that something could happen. Because that time of my life, that frame of my life froze, okay? I have a lot of empathy for the families of these 4 victims because I've been there. Now, not tragically like them, okay, but I'm in that club. And I can guarantee you, people are going to have opinions about Brian. Well, great, okay? Embrace him. Give him a big hug, okay? That's okay. You're entitled to do that. You're entitled to do that. But more importantly, maybe look inside of yourself and ask yourself why you're not embracing the victims. That's a bigger question. Okay? Embrace the victims, and then maybe you'll see the suspect. But if you choose not to do that, that's up to you. And I love you either way, personally. Okay, the universe is on schedule. I think that's a good break. I want to thank you two, Francine and Dr. Gary. I mean, I love you both as friends and colleagues. And I just think, Francine, you have to come back and let's break down Heuermann like Dr. Gary talked about, because there's a ton there on that one. I mean, Gary said, we've just seen the tip of the iceberg, and now we're up 3 more victims. So I think we're up to 7 now. And Gary, you said at least you thought we'd probably see at least 12.
That's the average for a sexually sadistic serial killer. He's guilty. That's the category he'd be in. I mean, that's the average I have in my own research. But you're talking about something that would have been active like 3 decades.
Yeah.
The idea that you'd stop at a number as low as that is rather ridiculous. And you also remember that the bail documents suggest that he had a torture chamber. That means you're so given over to the fantasy that you've made it into a kind of art. That's not a person who's going to commit a few crimes and stop. It's a person so given over to something that it's their passion. The way you have a whole room dedicated to it. Can you imagine if you had a hobby that was so a pastime, a thing you did that you were so obsessed with, you had to make a room for it? I mean, just think about it like that. I mean, imagine the killing room. I mean, imagine how given over to it you'd have to be, and that's what you're dealing with. So, I mean, just no. This is not somebody where you're going to find 7 victims, right?
You'll have to plan on a long time for that one.
Oh yeah. No,
maybe you do two episodes.
Yeah. No, but Francine, I could talk to you all day. I personally, consider you, one of those unsung heroes in the field, and I hope one day, there's there's a Hulu series about you, because like they did about Dr. Burgess, because I think you really are very
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I mean, you are. Wouldn't you say, Chris?
Oh yeah, she's the goat, as they say, which is, I guess, is a compliment today, Francine, where you know everything. So
Greatest of all time.
in my opinion, you know DNA better than anybody, and I'm grateful. So will you come back for Heuermann?
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's schedule that. Everybody, we appreciate your respect and having great opinions, pluses and negatives. That's always a good thing, especially in today's society, where we keep hitting each other over the head over difference of opinions. Let's keep it moving in either way, plus or minus. So thank you so much for being here this evening. Are you guys ready to go to Hawaii?
I'm ready.
Yeah, and thank you, mods. We love you guys. Aloha. See you on the next one.
Aloha.
Hard working every day, I'm stressed out 24/7, babe. No timeouts, wish we could fly away. You and I go to our favorite place. Oh yeah, make special memories together. I'll be your company now and forever. I say we fly away, you and me, go to our favorite place. Feeling the sun on my face in Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. I need a summer breeze, some fresh air to put my mind at ease. No one cares. You wanna come with me? Me and you go to our favorite tree. Are you ready now? We jump on a plane now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. Don't hesitate now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away.